The story of Apollo begins not with triumph, but with desperate flight across the wine-dark waters of the Aegean Sea. Leto, daughter of the Titans Coeus and Phoebe, found herself pregnant with Zeus's children and facing the murderous rage of Hera, the king of God's wife. The Queen of Olympus had decreed that no land under the sun should give shelter to her husband's lover, and her divine wrath carried such weight that every island, every stretch of coastline, every mountain peak trembled at her approach and refused Leto sanctuary. For months, Leto wandered the Mediterranean world, her divine pregnancy growing more burdensome with each passing day. The twin children within her womb possessed such power that their presence caused earthquakes and storms wherever their mother travelled. Coastal cities watched in terror as the pregnant Titaness approached their harbours, only to turn away when Hera's threats reached their ears. Even the most remote islands in the outer reaches of the Aegean sent her away, unwilling to face the Queen's vengeance. The situation grew increasingly desperate as Leto's time approached. Ancient sources describe her condition in stark terms. The goddess could find no stable ground upon which to give birth, no sanctuary where she might safely deliver the children who would reshape the Greek pantheon. It was then that her sister Asteria, who had been transformed into a floating island after fleeing Zeus's advances, took pity on her siblings' plight. Delos, as this wandering island was known, had spent years drifting aimlessly through the Aegean, never remaining in one location long enough to be considered true land. Because it possessed no fixed position, Hera's curse could not take hold there. The barren rock, barely 3 miles long and less than a mile wide, offered the only refuge available to the desperate Leto. Yet even Delos hesitated, fearing that once the powerful children were born, they might abandon the humble island for grander locations. Leto made a solemn oath that would forever change both her fate and that of Delos. She swore that her son would establish his greatest temple and oracle on this very island, making it the centre of his worship throughout the Greek world. Only then did Delos agree to provide sanctuary, and the floating island suddenly anchored itself in the Cyclades. Its wandering days ended forever. The birth itself proved as extraordinary as the circumstances surrounding it. Labour lasted 9 days and 9 nights, with Leto clinging to a palm tree on the island's highest point. All the goddesses of Olympus attended except Hera, who kept Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, trapped on Mount Olympus to prevent the delivery. Only when the other deities sent Iris with a golden necklace as tribute did Eileithyia slip away to assist Leto. Artemis emerged first, and according to ancient tradition immediately began helping with her brother's delivery. The birth of Apollo followed, and the moment he drew his first breath, the entire island of Delos blazed with golden light. The barren rock suddenly bloomed with vegetation. Olive trees sprouted from the soil, grapevines wound around the cliffs, and flowers carpeted the previously desolate landscape. Springs of fresh water burst from the ground, and the air filled with the sound of singing birds. What distinguished Apollo's birth from that of other divine children was his immediate assumption of power and authority. While still wrapped in swaddling clothes, the newborn god spoke his first words, declaring his dominion over 3 crucial aspects of human and divine existence. He claimed prophecy as his first domain, announcing that he would serve as Zeus's spokesman to mortals, revealing the will of the gods through oracles and divine signs. His second declaration concerned music and poetry. He would inspire mortals to create beautiful songs and harmonious melodies, bringing order and beauty to human expression. Finally, he claimed mastery over archery, promising to wield the silver bow with unerring accuracy. These proclamations were not mere boasts. Ancient sources describe how the infant Apollo's divine nature manifested immediately through physical signs that left no doubt about his future greatness. His hair gleamed like spun gold, catching and reflecting light in ways that seemed to generate illumination, rather than simply reflect it. His eyes held the deep blue of the Mediterranean sky at noon, and when he looked upon something, observers claimed they could see knowledge and understanding far beyond mortal comprehension. the newborn's physical proportions defied natural law. Though technically an infant, Apollo possessed the perfectly formed features of a young man in his prime. His limbs showed the muscular definition of an accomplished athlete, his hands the long, elegant fingers of a master musician. When he moved, even the simple gestures of reaching or grasping displayed an inherent grace that marked him as fundamentally different from both mortals and many of his divine relatives. The twin birth of Apollo and Artemis established a cosmic balance that would influence Greek religious thought for centuries. While their relationship as siblings remained constant throughout various mythological traditions, their roles as complementary forces in the natural world evolved significantly over time. In the earliest traditions, Artemis governed the hunt and wild places, serving as protector of young animals and patron of virginity. Apollo's initial associations centered on disease and healing, prophecy, and the maintenance of social order through law and custom. The later identification of Apollo with the sun and Artemis with the moon represented a significant development in Greek cosmological thinking. This solar association did not appear in the earliest sources, where Helios remained the primary sun deity. However, by the 5th century BC, Apollo had absorbed many of Helios's attributes, becoming the god who drove the sun chariot across the sky each day. This transformation reflected changing Greek attitudes toward divine power and cosmic order. The solar Apollo represented more than mere celestial mechanics. His daily journey from east to west symbolized the triumph of order over chaos, light over darkness, knowledge over ignorance. The regularity of his path demonstrated divine reliability and cosmic stability. When Apollo Helios failed to appear, as during eclipses, the Greeks interpreted this as a sign of divine displeasure or cosmic disruption. Artemis's lunar associations developed along parallel lines. As goddess of the hunt, she naturally governed nighttime activities when many wild animals were most active. Her connection to the monthly cycles linked her to women's fertility and the agricultural calendar. The waxing and waning of the moon reflected her dual nature as both creator and destroyer, protector of the young and bringer of sudden death. The establishment of Apollo's cult began immediately after his birth, with Delos serving as the first and most important centre of worship. The island's transformation from barren rock to fertile sanctuary provided tangible proof of the god's power and favour. Within generations, pilgrims travelled from across the Greek world to witness the sacred palm tree where Leto had given birth, and to participate in the elaborate festivals held in Apollo's honour. The Delian festivals, held every 4 years, became among the most significant religious gatherings in the ancient Mediterranean. These celebrations combined athletic competitions, musical contests, and religious ceremonies in ways that demonstrated Apollo's diverse influences on human culture. Athletes competed in running, wrestling, and boxing matches, while musicians and poets presented new compositions honouring the god. The religious ceremonies included elaborate processions, sacrificial offerings, and the recitation of hymns that preserved and transmitted mythological traditions. From Delos, Apollo's worship spread rapidly throughout the Greek colonies and trading networks. The god's association with prophecy made him particularly attractive to communities facing uncertain futures or difficult decisions. His connection to music and poetry ensured his popularity among the educated classes who valued cultural refinement. His role as a healing deity brought desperate supplicants seeking cures for diseases that mortal physicians could not treat. The Oracle at Delphi, though established later than the Delian sanctuary, ultimately became Apollo's most famous and influential cult site. The Pythian priestess, speaking in Apollo's voice, provided guidance to individuals and city-states on matters ranging from personal relationships to military campaigns. The cryptic nature of these prophecies required careful interpretation, leading to the development of a sophisticated priestly class skilled in divination and religious lore. Archaeological evidence from early Apollo sanctuaries reveals the rapid evolution of his worship practices. The earliest temples were simple structures, often built around natural features like springs or groves that were believed to possess sacred properties. As his cult grew in importance and wealth, these humble beginnings gave way to elaborate marble temples decorated with sculptures depicting the god's mythological exploits. The artistic representations of Apollo from this early period show remarkable consistency across different regions and time periods. He appears as an eternally youthful male figure, typically nude or lightly draped, holding either a lyre or a silver bow. His hair is usually depicted as long and golden, often bound with a laurel wreath that became one of his most recognizable symbols. The idealized proportions of these statues established artistic standards that influenced Greek sculpture for centuries. The rapid acceptance of Apollo among the 12 Olympian deities reflected both his impressive divine credentials and his practical utility to Greek society. Unlike some gods whose worship remained regional or specialized, Apollo's diverse portfolio of responsibilities made him relevant to virtually every aspect of human experience. Farmers sought his favor for good harvests, soldiers for victory in battle, artists for inspiration, and the sick for healing. His integration into the Olympian hierarchy also served important political functions for the expanding Greek world. As communities established new colonies around the Mediterranean, they carried Apollo's worship with them, creating networks of shared religious practice that facilitated trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The god's emphasis on order, law, and civilized behavior provided ideological support for Greek claims of cultural superiority over neighboring peoples. The theological implications of Apollo's birth and early development extended far beyond simple religious observance. His immediate assumption of adult responsibilities and powers challenged traditional understandings of divine development and authority. Unlike gods who gradually accumulated their domains through conquest or inheritance, Apollo arrived fully formed with clearly defined spheres of influence. This precocious divinity reflected broader changes in Greek religious thinking during the Archaic period. As city-states developed more sophisticated political and social institutions, they required deities who could provide immediate practical assistance, rather than merely embodying natural forces. Apollo's combination of prophetic insight, cultural refinement, and healing power made him an ideal patron for communities seeking to distinguish themselves through achievement rather than mere survival. The establishment of Apollo's prophetic authority at Delphi began with an act of divine violence that would transform the religious landscape of ancient Greece forever. Following his birth on Delos and his rapid assumption of godhood, Apollo set his sights on the ancient sanctuary nestled in the rocky slopes of Mount Parnassus in central Greece. This site, known as Pytho in the earliest sources, had served as a sacred place for millennia before Apollo's arrival, but it belonged to forces far older and more primordial than the young Olympian god. The guardian of this ancient sanctuary was Python, a monstrous serpent born from the primordial mud left behind after Deucalion's flood. Ancient sources describe Python as a creature of immense size and terrible power, with scales that gleamed like polished bronze and eyes that burned with the wisdom and malice of the earth itself. The serpent measured over 100 feet in length, with a body thick as the trunk of an ancient oak tree. Its presence at Pytho represented the continuation of chthonic religious practices that predated the arrival of the Olympian deities by countless generations. Python served as the Oracle of Gaia, the primordial earth goddess, delivering prophecies that emerged directly from the depths of the earth through the sacred fissures in the rock. Supplicants who sought divine guidance would approach the serpent's lair with offerings of honey, milk, and grain, substances that connected them to the agricultural cycles and natural fertility that Gaia represented. The prophecies delivered through Python carried the authority of the earth itself, speaking truths that emerged from the fundamental forces of creation and destruction. Apollo's confrontation with Python represented more than a simple territorial dispute between deities. The conflict embodied the broader transition occurring throughout the Greek world as newer, more organized religious systems displaced older, more chaotic forms of worship. The young god arrived at Pytho armed with a silver bow crafted by the Cyclopes, its arrows capable of striking with the precision and inevitability of divine justice. Ancient accounts describe the weapon as a marvel of divine craftsmanship, with a bowstring that sang with musical tones when drawn, and arrows that never missed their intended target. The battle itself unfolded with the swift brutality characteristic of divine conflicts. Python, sensing the approach of the young god, emerged from the sacred cave with a roar that shook the mountainside and sent rock slides cascading down the slopes of Parnassus. The serpent's breath carried the scent of decay and ancient earth, while its movements generated clouds of dust that obscured the sun. Apollo faced this primordial terror with the calm confidence of youth and divine power, drawing his silver bow with steady hands despite the creature's intimidating presence. The god's first arrow struck Python between the eyes, penetrating the creature's bronze-hard scales with ease. The serpent's death throes lasted for hours, its massive body writhing across the sacred precinct as divine ichor flowed from the wound. The creature's final movements carved new channels in the rocky ground, and its blood seeped into the earth, forever altering the sacred geography of the site. When Python finally died, its body began to decompose with supernatural speed, releasing vapours that would play a crucial role in the prophetic practices that followed. Apollo's victory over Python required ritual purification before he could claim the sanctuary as his own. The act of killing, even in the context of divine justice, created a state of pollution that needed cleansing through proper religious observance. The god withdrew to the Vale of Tempe in northern Greece, where he underwent purification rites that lasted for 8 years. During this period, he served as a shepherd to King Admetus of Pherae, demonstrating the principle that even gods must accept consequences for their actions and submit to the requirements of cosmic justice. The transformation of Pytho into Delphi began immediately upon Apollo's return from his purification. The god established new religious practices that incorporated elements of the older chthonic traditions while asserting his own authority over prophetic revelation. The sacred fissure from which Python had emerged became the focal point of the new oracle, but instead of a monstrous serpent, Apollo appointed a mortal woman to serve as his prophetic mouthpiece. This priestess, known as the Pythia in honour of the slain serpent, would channel the god's divine knowledge through carefully regulated ritual procedures. The selection and preparation of the Pythia involved complex religious protocols that evolved over centuries of practice. Candidates for the position were chosen from among the local women of Delphi, with preference given to those who demonstrated natural sensitivity to divine influence. Early Pythias were typically young virgins, but as the oracle's importance grew and the demands of the position became more intense, older women past childbearing age were selected instead. This change reflected practical considerations about the physical and mental demands of prophetic possession, as well as concerns about maintaining the priestess's ritual purity. The Pythia's preparation for prophetic sessions involved elaborate purification rituals that began days before each consultation period. She bathed in the sacred Castalian spring, which flowed from a cleft in the rocks near Apollo's temple, its waters believed to possess purifying properties that cleansed both body and spirit. The priestess then fasted for 3 days, consuming only sacred barley bread and water from the spring. During this period, she remained in seclusion within the temple precincts, avoiding contact with anyone except the other temple officials who assisted in her preparation. On the day of prophetic consultation, the Pythia entered the inner sanctum of Apollo's temple, known as the Aditon, where the sacred vapours still rose from the fissure that had once been Python's lair. Modern archaeological investigations have revealed that this chamber was built directly over a geological fault line, where natural gases including ethylene could seep through cracks in the limestone bedrock. These gases, combined with the burning of laurel leaves and barley meal, created an atmosphere that induced altered states of consciousness in the priestess. The physical layout of the prophetic chamber reflected careful attention to both practical and symbolic considerations. The adyton was positioned at the lowest level of the temple, emphasizing its connection to the chthonic forces of the earth. A golden tripod stood over the sacred fissure, supporting a bronze cauldron where the Pythia sat during her prophetic trances. The tripod itself became one of the most recognizable symbols of Delphic prophecy, representing the intersection between earthly and divine knowledge. The consultation process involved multiple participants beyond the Pythia herself. Supplicants seeking prophetic guidance first underwent purification rituals and paid substantial fees to the temple treasury. They then presented their questions to the Pythia through intermediary priests, who translated the priestess's often incoherent utterances into the cryptic but comprehensible responses for which the Delphic oracle became famous. These interpretive priests, known as prophets, possessed extensive training in religious law, mythology, and political affairs that enabled them to craft responses that address the supplicant's concerns while maintaining the oracle's reputation for accuracy. The political significance of Delphi emerged rapidly as Greek city-states recognized the oracle's potential for legitimizing important decisions and policies. The concept of Delphi as the navel of the world developed from a mythological tradition claiming that Zeus released two eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and they met at Delphi, marking it as the world's center. This designation carried enormous political weight, as it implied that decisions made at Delphi possessed universal validity rather than merely local authority. The oracle's influence on colonization efforts demonstrates its early political importance. Greek communities planning to establish new settlements routinely consulted the Pythia about suitable locations, favourable timing, and appropriate patron deities for their colonies. These consultations served multiple functions beyond simple religious observance. They provided a mechanism for coordinating colonial activities among different city-states, helped establish legitimate claims to distant territories, and created networks of shared religious obligation that facilitated trade and diplomatic relations. The famous maxims inscribed at Delphi represented a synthesis of practical wisdom and philosophical insight that influenced Greek intellectual development for centuries. The most famous of these inscriptions, "Know thyself" and "Tunde nothing in excess," were attributed to various legendary sages, but became associated with Apollo's divine wisdom. These aphorisms reflected the god's role as a civilizing force who promoted self-awareness, moderation, and rational behavior among mortals. Know thyself carried implications that extended far beyond simple self-awareness. In the context of Greek religious thought, this maxim reminded mortals of their fundamental limitations and the necessity of recognizing divine authority. It encouraged introspection and honest self-assessment, while warning against the hubris that could lead to divine punishment. The inscription served as a constant reminder to supplicants approaching the oracle that they should examine their own motives and limitations before seeking divine guidance. Nothing in excess promoted the principle of moderation that became central to Greek ethical thinking. This maxim warned against extremes in behavior, emotion, and ambition, advocating instead for the balanced approach to life that the Greeks termed sophrosine. The principle applied to religious observance as well as secular activities, encouraging appropriate reverence for the gods without the fanatical excess that characterized some mystery religions. The development of Delphi as a religious center attracted craftsmen, merchants, and scholars who contributed to its growing influence throughout the Mediterranean world. The sanctuary's wealth, derived from consultation fees and votive offerings, funded elaborate building projects that demonstrated Apollo's power and attracted additional pilgrims. The temple complex expanded to include treasuries built by various city-states to house their offerings, a theatre for musical competitions, and a stadium for athletic contests that became part of the Pythian Games. The Pythian Games, held every 4 years in honour of Apollo's victory over Python, became one of the 4 major Panhellenic festivals alongside the Olympic, Nemean and Isthmian Games. These competitions emphasised musical and poetic contests more than athletic events, reflecting Apollo's patronage of the arts. Winners received crowns of laurel leaves cut from the sacred grove near the temple, establishing the laurel wreath as a symbol of achievement that persisted long after the ancient games ended. The oracle's influence on interstate relations grew as city-states began consulting the Pythia about military campaigns, alliance formations, and treaty negotiations. The priestess's responses often contained enough ambiguity to allow multiple interpretations, enabling the oracle to maintain credibility regardless of subsequent events. This diplomatic flexibility made Delphi valuable as a neutral mediator in conflicts between Greek communities, as all parties could claim divine support for their positions while accepting compromise solutions. The economic impact of Delphi's religious prominence extended throughout central Greece and beyond. Pilgrims travelling to consult the oracle required food, lodging and transportation, creating opportunities for local merchants and service providers. The sanctuary's demand for luxury goods to serve as offerings attracted traders from across the Mediterranean, while the temple's construction projects employed skilled artisans whose techniques influenced architectural development throughout the Greek world. The establishment of Apollo's authority at Delphi marked only the beginning of his efforts to secure recognition as the supreme deity of music, prophecy, and cultural refinement. Throughout the archaic and classical periods, the god faced numerous challenges to his artistic supremacy from both mortal and divine competitors who dared to question his mastery of the musical arts. These contests, far from being mere entertainment, served as crucial demonstrations of divine hierarchy and the consequences of challenging Olympian authority. The most infamous of these musical competitions involved Marsyas, a satyr who had discovered the double flute that Athena had crafted and subsequently discarded. According to the mythological tradition preserved by multiple ancient sources, Athena had invented the aulos, a reed instrument capable of producing haunting melodies that rivaled the beauty of Apollo's lyre. However, when the goddess observed her reflection while playing the instrument, she noticed how the effort of blowing into the reeds distorted her features, puffing out her cheeks in an undignified manner. In a fit of vanity, she threw the instrument aside and pronounced a curse upon anyone who dared to pick it up. Marsyas, a creature of the wild woodlands who possessed the typical satyr's combination of human intelligence and bestial appetites, discovered the abandoned flute while wandering through the forests of Phrygia in Asia Minor. The moment his lips touched the instrument, it began producing melodies of extraordinary beauty, as if Athena's divine craftsmanship had imbued it with its own musical consciousness. The satyr found that he could produce complex harmonies and intricate rhythms that seemed to flow directly from the instrument itself, requiring minimal skill or training on his part. Word of Marsyas's musical abilities spread rapidly throughout the region, attracting audiences who marvelled at the satyr's performances. Unlike Apollo's measured, harmonious compositions that emphasized order and mathematical precision, Marsyas's music possessed a wild, primal energy that spoke directly to the emotions. His melodies could drive listeners to ecstatic dancing, reduce them to tears, or fill them with inexplicable longing for distant places and forgotten memories. The contrast between his rustic appearance and the sophistication of his music created a compelling paradox that drew ever larger crowds. The satyr's growing reputation eventually reached Apollo's attention, and the god found himself facing an unprecedented situation. For the first time since assuming his role as patron of music and the arts, a mortal creature was being praised for musical abilities that some claim had surpassed his own. The comparison struck at the very foundation of Apollo's divine identity, challenging not merely his technical skill but his fundamental authority over artistic expression. Marsyas, emboldened by his success and perhaps influenced by the intoxicating effects of his own music, made the fatal decision to challenge Apollo directly to a musical contest. The satyr's hubris reflected a common theme in Greek mythology, where mortals who achieved exceptional abilities inevitably overreached their proper bounds and invited divine retribution. However, Marsyas's case was complicated by the fact that his instrument was itself of divine origin, creating ambiguity about whether his abilities truly represented mortal achievement or divine favour. Apollo accepted the challenge with the cold fury characteristic of his responses to perceived slights against his authority. The god proposed terms that revealed both his confidence in victory and his intention to make the contest a demonstration of divine justice. The winner would be permitted to do whatever he wished to the loser, a condition that Marsyas accepted without fully considering its implications. The satyr's agreement to these terms demonstrated the dangerous combination of artistic pride and naive trust that would ultimately prove his undoing. The contest was held in a grove sacred to Apollo near the Phrygian city of Selene, with the Muses serving as judges. This choice of arbiters ensured that the competition would be evaluated according to divine rather than mortal standards of musical excellence. The Muses, as daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, possessed the authority to render binding judgments on matters of artistic merit, and their decision would carry the weight of cosmic law. The first round of the contest showcased the fundamental differences between the two competitors' approaches to musical expression. Apollo performed with his golden lyre, producing melodies that demonstrated perfect mathematical relationships between notes, harmonious chord progressions that reflected the cosmic order, and rhythmic patterns that echoed the regular movements of celestial bodies. His music embodied the principles of civilization, rationality, and divine authority that characterized Olympian culture. Marsyas responded with performances on his double flute that emphasized emotional intensity over mathematical precision. His melodies twisted and turned through unexpected intervals, creating harmonies that challenged conventional musical theory while producing powerful emotional responses in his listeners. The satyr's music spoke to the wild, untamed aspects of human nature, evoking memories of humanity's pre-civilized past when survival depended on instinct rather than reason. The Muses initially declared the first round a tie, acknowledging the technical excellence of both performances while noting their fundamentally different aesthetic approaches. This judgment infuriated Apollo, who had expected immediate recognition of his superiority. The god's anger reflected not merely wounded pride, but genuine concern about the implications of the contest's outcome. If a satyr could match the musical abilities of an Olympian deity, what did this suggest about the nature of divine authority and the hierarchy that maintained cosmic order? For the second round, Apollo introduced a new element that would determine the contest's outcome. The god announced that both competitors would perform while doing something that was impossible with their respective instruments. They would play their music upside down. Apollo demonstrated this technique by inverting his lyre and continuing to produce beautiful melodies by singing along with the instrument's accompaniment. His divine voice complemented the lyre's tones perfectly, creating a musical experience that transcended the limitations of any single instrument. Marsyas attempted to match this performance but found himself unable to play his double flute while inverted. The instrument's design required proper positioning of the reeds in relation to the player's mouth, making Apollo's challenge physically impossible to meet. The satyr's failure to adapt to the new requirements demonstrated what Apollo claimed was the fundamental difference between divine and mortal artistic ability. True mastery required the flexibility to transcend the limitations of any particular medium. The Muses declared Apollo the winner, and the god immediately exercised his right to determine Marsyas's fate. The punishment Apollo chose revealed the brutal reality behind the Olympian god's claims to represent civilization and justice. He ordered the satyr to be flayed alive, stripping away his skin with methodical precision, while Marsyas remained conscious throughout the ordeal. the god's actions contradicted his own teachings about moderation and justice, demonstrating that divine authority ultimately rested on power rather than moral superiority. The aftermath of Marsyas's death created lasting consequences that rippled throughout the natural world. The satyr's blood soaked into the earth, creating the river Marsyas in Phrygia, while the tears of his fellow woodland creatures formed streams that fed the river's flow. The nymphs and satyrs who had gathered to witness the contest fled into the deepest parts of the forest, their faith in divine justice permanently shattered by Apollo's excessive punishment. Apollo's treatment of Marsyas established a pattern of divine response to artistic challenges that would be repeated in subsequent contests. The god's intolerance for criticism or competition in his chosen domains reflected broader Olympian attitudes toward mortal achievement. While the gods encouraged human excellence in various fields, they demanded recognition that divine abilities remained fundamentally superior to mortal accomplishments. The musical contest with Pan presented a different but equally revealing challenge to Apollo's artistic supremacy. Pan, the rustic god of shepherds and wild places, possessed a more legitimate claim to divine status than Marsyas, making their competition a conflict between different types of divinity rather than a simple assertion of divine superiority over mortal pretension. Pan's invention of the syrinx, or panpipes, had given him a devoted following among rural populations who appreciated music that reflected their connection to the natural world. Pan's musical style emphasized simplicity and emotional directness over the complex harmonies and sophisticated techniques that characterized Apollo's performances. The shepherd god's melodies captured the sounds of wind through mountain valleys, the gentle lowing of cattle, and the rhythmic patterns of seasonal agricultural work. His music spoke to audiences who valued authenticity and traditional ways of life over the urban sophistication that Apollo's art represented. The contest between Apollo and Pan took place on Mount Tmolus in Lydia, with the mountain god himself serving as judge. This choice of arbiter seemed to favour Pan, as Tmolus represented the ancient, chthonic forces of the earth that predated Olympian authority. However, the mountain god's judgment ultimately favoured Apollo, recognising the technical superiority and divine authority of the sun god's musical performance. King Midas of Phrygia, who had been granted the power to turn everything he touched into gold, attended the contest as a spectator. When Tmolus announced Apollo's victory, Midas foolishly expressed disagreement with the judgment, claiming that Pan's music possessed greater beauty and emotional power than Apollo's technically perfect but emotionally distant performance. The king's criticism reflected the perspective of someone who valued sincerity and natural expression over artificial refinement. Apollo's response to Midas's criticism demonstrated his complete intolerance for any questioning of his artistic authority. The god transformed the king's ears into those of an ass, creating a permanent reminder of what Apollo considered the appropriate relationship between divine wisdom and mortal judgment. Midas's punishment served as a warning to others who might be tempted to prefer rustic authenticity over divine sophistication. The transformation of Midas's ears created ongoing humiliation for the king, who was forced to wear a turban to conceal his disfigurement from his subjects. Only his barber knew the secret of the king's altered appearance, and the burden of maintaining this knowledge eventually drove the servant to desperate measures. Unable to keep the secret any longer, the barber dug a hole in a remote field and whispered the truth into the earth, hoping to relieve his psychological torment without directly betraying his master's trust. The earth itself, however, could not contain such a significant secret. Reeds that grew from the spot where the barber had spoken began whispering the truth about Midas's ears whenever the wind blew through them. The story spread throughout the kingdom and beyond, ensuring that Apollo's punishment achieved its intended purpose of demonstrating the consequences of challenging divine artistic judgment. The conflicts between Apollo and Dionysus represented a more complex and ongoing rivalry that reflected fundamental differences in their approaches to divine influence and human worship. While both gods claimed authority over aspects of human cultural expression, their methods and objectives differed dramatically. Apollo emphasized order, rationality, and the civilizing influence of artistic refinement, while Dionysus promoted ecstatic experience, emotional liberation, and the breakdown of conventional social boundaries. These competing philosophies created tension wherever their spheres of influence intersected. Apollo's musical traditions emphasized formal structure, mathematical relationships between notes, and the elevation of human consciousness through exposure to divine harmony. Dionysiac music, by contrast, used repetitive rhythms, intoxicating melodies, and the deliberate cultivation of altered states of consciousness to dissolve the barriers between human and divine experience. The rivalry extended beyond musical preferences to encompass broader questions about the proper relationship between gods and mortals. Apollo's worship emphasized the maintenance of appropriate boundaries between divine and human realms, encouraging mortals to seek wisdom and inspiration while recognizing their fundamental limitations. Dionysiac religion deliberately blurred these boundaries, offering followers direct participation in divine experience through ritual intoxication and ecstatic possession. The tension between these approaches created ongoing conflicts in Greek religious practice. Communities that embraced Apollonian values of moderation and rational inquiry often viewed Dionysiac festivals as threats to social order and moral stability. Conversely, those who found meaning in Dionysiac liberation regarded Apollonian restraint as artificial repression of natural human impulses. Apollo's competitive nature extended beyond these major contests to encompass numerous smaller challenges and demonstrations of his superiority in various artistic and intellectual domains. The god regularly participated in competitions with other deities, mortal artists, and mythological figures, consistently using these opportunities to reinforce his status as the ultimate arbiter of cultural excellence. These contests served multiple functions within the broader framework of Greek religious and social organization. They provided entertainment and spectacle for both divine and mortal audiences, while simultaneously reinforcing important cultural values about the relationship between talent, effort, and recognition. The consistent pattern of Apollo's victories demonstrated that true excellence required divine favour, and that mortal achievements, however impressive, remained subordinate to divine authority. The god's intolerance for artistic criticism or competition also reflected practical concerns about maintaining religious authority in an increasingly sophisticated cultural environment. As Greek civilization developed more complex artistic traditions and philosophical schools, the potential for mortal achievements to rival or surpass traditional divine accomplishments created genuine challenges to established religious hierarchies. Apollo's victories in divine competitions established his supremacy in the artistic realm, but his interactions with mortals revealed a far more vulnerable aspect of his divine nature. The god who commanded absolute obedience from satyrs and rival deities found himself repeatedly frustrated and wounded by his romantic pursuits of mortal beings. These relationships, marked by rejection, transformation, and death, created a pattern of unfulfilled desire that would define much of Apollo's mythological legacy and provide insight into ancient Greek understanding of the fundamental incompatibility between divine love and mortal existence. The most famous and tragic of these pursuits began when Apollo first laid eyes upon Daphne, daughter of the river god Peneus, as she hunted in the forest of Thessaly. Unlike many of Apollo's romantic interests, Daphne was not a mortal woman but a nymph, one of the minor deities associated with natural features like rivers, trees, and mountains. Her divine parentage granted her immortality and supernatural abilities, but these advantages proved insufficient protection against Apollo's relentless pursuit. Daphne had dedicated herself to perpetual virginity, following the example of Artemis and rejecting all romantic advances from gods and mortals alike. She spent her days hunting with a silver bow, her golden hair flowing freely as she raced through mountain valleys and forest glades. Her beauty was renowned throughout the region. She possessed the lithe build of an accomplished athlete, with sun-bronzed skin that glowed with divine radiance and eyes the deep green of forest pools. When she moved through the wilderness, deer and other woodland creatures showed no fear, recognizing her as a kindred spirit who belonged to the wild places of the world. Apollo's infatuation with Daphne struck him with unprecedented intensity, overwhelming his usual calculated approach to romantic conquest. The god found himself unable to concentrate on his duties, abandoning his daily journey across the sky to spend hours watching the nymph from hidden vantage points. His divine responsibilities suffered as he became increasingly obsessed with winning her affections through displays of his power and accomplishments. The god's initial attempts at courtship followed conventional patterns of divine wooing. He appeared before Daphne in his most magnificent form, his golden hair crowned with laurel leaves and his muscled torso gleaming with divine light. Apollo recounted his victories over Python and Marsyas, demonstrated his mastery of the lyre by composing songs in her honour, and offered her gifts that included prophecies of the future and healing herbs that could cure any ailment. These presentations, which had successfully impressed other potential lovers, left Daphne completely unmoved. Her rejection of his advances only intensified Apollo's desire, creating a psychological dynamic that revealed the god's fundamental inability to accept denial of his wishes. Apollo had grown accustomed to immediate compliance with his desires, whether from mortals seeking divine favour or from other deities acknowledging his authority. Daphne's indifference to his status and accomplishments challenged his understanding of how the universe operated, creating an obsession that consumed increasing amounts of his time and attention. The pursuit that followed became a literal chase across the landscape of northern Greece. Apollo abandoned all pretense of dignified courtship and began hunting Daphne with the same relentless determination he'd once applied to tracking Python. The god's pursuit took him through dense forests, where branches caught at his golden hair, across rushing streams that soaked his divine garments, and up rocky mountainsides that left even his immortal feet bloodied and sore. Daphne fled with the desperate speed of a creature fighting for its life, her knowledge of the wilderness giving her temporary advantages over her divine pursuer. She leapt across chasms that would have killed mortal hunters, scaled cliff faces with the agility of a mountain goat, and navigated through thorn thickets that tore at her hunting tunic without slowing her pace. The nymph's endurance, while supernatural by mortal standards, could not match that of an Olympian deity, and she gradually felt Apollo gaining ground behind her. The chase continued for days, with Apollo drawing steadily closer despite Daphne's intimate knowledge of the terrain. The god's persistence began to take on a predatory quality that transformed what he had initially conceived as romantic pursuit into something far more sinister. His calls to Daphne shifted from declarations of love to demands that she submit to his will, revealing the entitled attitude that characterized many of his relationships with beings he considered his inferiors. As Apollo's hands reached out to grasp her flowing hair, Daphne made a desperate plea to her father Peneus for salvation from her pursuer. The river god, hearing his daughter's terrified cries echoing across the water, responded with the only protection he could provide, transformation that would place her permanently beyond Apollo's reach. The metamorphosis began at her feet, which suddenly took root in the earth like tree trunks, sending out a network of roots that anchored her to the spot. The transformation progressed upward through her body with supernatural speed. Her legs fused together and hardened into the trunk of a laurel tree, while her arms stretched skyward and sprouted branches heavy with the glossy green leaves that would become Apollo's sacred symbol. Her golden hair became a crown of foliage that rustled in the wind, and her smooth skin transformed into bark that retained something of her original beauty in its elegant patterns and warm coloration. Apollo arrived at the moment of transformation's completion, his outstretched hands touching bark instead of the warm flesh he had pursued so desperately. The god's reaction to Daphne's escape revealed both his genuine grief at losing her and his inability to accept responsibility for driving her to such desperate measures. He pressed his ear against the trunk and claimed to hear her heartbeat still pulsing within the wood, interpreting this as evidence that some part of her remained available to him despite her transformation. Rather than recognizing the transformation as a rejection of his advances, Apollo chose to interpret Daphne's metamorphosis as a form of eternal union between them. He declared the laurel tree sacred to himself and decreed that its leaves would crown victors in athletic competitions, musical contests, and military campaigns. This appropriation of Daphne's transformed body as his personal symbol demonstrated the god's capacity for self-deception and his tendency to reshape reality to conform to his desires rather than accepting unwelcome truths. The laurel crown became one of the most enduring symbols associated with Apollo's worship, appearing in artistic representations, athletic competitions, and political ceremonies throughout the ancient world. The Greeks who wore these crowns likely understood the mythological significance of their decoration, but the symbol's association with victory and achievement gradually overshadowed its origins in divine obsession and nymphs' desperate flight from unwanted attention. Apollo's relationship with Cassandra, Princess of Troy, followed a different but equally tragic pattern that revealed another aspect of the god's approach to romantic rejection. Cassandra possessed extraordinary beauty, with long dark hair, intelligent brown eyes, and the refined features characteristic of Trojan nobility. More importantly, she displayed an unusual sensitivity to divine influence that made her an attractive candidate for Apollo's priesthood. The god's initial interest in her combined romantic desire with practical considerations about expanding his prophetic authority in the wealthy and influential city of Troy. Apollo's courtship of Cassandra began with an offer that seemed genuinely beneficial to both parties. The god promised to grant her the gift of prophecy in exchange for her love, presenting this arrangement as a mutually advantageous partnership rather than simple divine seduction. Cassandra's acceptance of the bargain reflected her genuine interest in serving as Apollo's priestess, and her belief that she could maintain appropriate boundaries between religious duty and personal relationships. The prophetic abilities Apollo granted Cassandra proved genuine and remarkably powerful. She could foresee future events with perfect accuracy, understanding not only what would happen, but also the complex chains of causation that would lead to specific outcomes. Her visions came to her as vivid, detailed experiences that felt more real than her ordinary waking consciousness, allowing her to witness future events as if she were physically present when they occurred. However, Cassandra's prophetic gifts came with inherent psychological costs that Apollo had not adequately explained. The constant awareness of future tragedies, wars, and deaths created an enormous emotional burden that few mortals could bear without suffering lasting damage. Cassandra found herself knowing about disasters she could not prevent, understanding the fatal flaws that would destroy people she cared about, and witnessing the eventual fall of her own city and family. When Apollo attempted to claim the romantic reward he believed Cassandra owed him for her prophetic abilities, the princess refused his advances. Her rejection stemmed partly from her growing understanding of the god's character revealed through her prophetic visions of his treatment of other lovers, and partly from her realization that accepting his romantic attention would compromise her ability to serve effectively as his priestess. Cassandra had come to value her prophetic role too highly to risk losing it through personal entanglement with the deity who had granted it. Apollo's response to Cassandra's rejection demonstrated a vindictive streak that contradicted his claims to represent justice and rational behaviour. Rather than withdrawing his gift of prophecy entirely, which would have been a straightforward punishment, the god chose a more subtle and psychologically devastating curse. He decreed that while Cassandra would retain her ability to foresee the future accurately, no one would ever believe her prophecies, regardless of how detailed or compelling her warnings might be. This curse created a form of psychological torture that surpassed simple loss of prophetic abilities. Cassandra found herself trapped in a nightmare of perfect knowledge and absolute powerlessness, able to see disasters approaching but incapable of convincing anyone to take preventive action. Her accurate predictions of Troy's eventual destruction, Paris's abduction of Helen, and the consequences of various military decisions were dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman or the manipulations of a treacherous woman seeking to undermine Trojan morale. The curse's effects extended beyond Cassandra's inability to prevent specific disasters to encompass her complete isolation from meaningful human relationships. Her family and friends gradually came to view her as mentally unstable, while her accurate but unbelieved prophecies created a reputation for spreading doom and gloom that made her unwelcome in most social situations. The princess, who'd once been celebrated for her intelligence and beauty, became a figure of pity and fear, avoided by those who found her presence uncomfortably disturbing. Apollo's relationship with Hyacinthus represented a different type of tragic love that revealed the god's capacity for genuine affection and devastating grief. Hyacinthus was a Spartan prince renowned throughout Greece for his extraordinary physical beauty and athletic abilities. Unlike Daphne's wild, nymph-like appearance or Cassandra's refined aristocratic features, Hyacinthus possessed the idealized masculine beauty that Greek culture associated with divine favor and heroic potential. The young prince stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and narrow waist of an accomplished athlete. His hair was golden brown, cut in the short style favoured by Spartan warriors, and his skin bore the bronze coloration that came from constant training under the Mediterranean sun. Hyacinthus excelled in all forms of athletic competition, but his particular specialty was the discus throw, where his combination of strength, timing and grace made him virtually unbeatable in the competitions throughout the Peloponnese. Apollo's attraction to Hyacinthus developed differently from his obsessive pursuit of female lovers. The god genuinely enjoyed the young man's company, finding pleasure in their shared athletic activities and intellectual conversations. Hyacinthus possessed a quick wit and genuine curiosity about divine matters that made him an engaging companion rather than simply an object of desire. Their relationship combined romantic love with authentic friendship in ways that Apollo had rarely experienced with mortal partners. The god spent increasing amounts of time in mortal form, participating in Hyacinthus's training sessions and accompanying him to athletic competitions throughout Greece. Apollo's presence enhanced the prince's already considerable abilities, but their relationship remained based on mutual respect and affection, rather than the divine dominance that characterized most of Apollo's romantic involvements. Hyacinthus treated Apollo as an equal despite knowing his divine identity, while Apollo restrained his tendency toward possessive behavior out of genuine care for his lover's independence. Their favorite activity involved discus throwing in a meadow outside Sparta, where they could compete privately without the crowds that gathered whenever Hyacinthus participated in public competitions. Apollo delighted in demonstrating divine techniques that pushed the boundaries of what mortal athletes could achieve, while Hyacinthus responded with the determined effort to match his lover's supernatural abilities through pure skill and determination. The tragic end to their relationship came during one of these private training sessions, when Apollo threw a discus with perhaps more force than necessary to demonstrate a particular technique. The bronze disc sailed through the air with tremendous speed, following a perfect trajectory that would have impressed even divine observers. Hyacinthus, eager to demonstrate his own abilities, ran forward to catch the discus at the peak of its flight, a maneuver that required precise timing and exceptional athletic skill. The prince's timing was fractionally off, and instead of catching the discus cleanly, it struck him in the forehead with devastating force. The impact created a wound that would have killed a mortal man instantly, but Hyacinthus's divine enhanced constitution kept him alive long enough for Apollo to reach his side. The god's frantic attempts to heal the injury proved futile, as the damage exceeded even divine medical abilities. Apollo's grief at Hyacinthus' death revealed emotional depths that the god rarely displayed in his other relationships. He held the dying prince in his arms, using his divine power to ease the pain while knowing that nothing could prevent the inevitable outcome. The god's tears, falling onto Hyacinthus' blood-soaked hair, created the first hyacinth flowers, their deep purple petals marked with darker lines that resemble the Greek letters AI, traditionally interpreted as an expression of grief and loss. The transformation of Hyacinthus' blood into flowers represented Apollo's attempt to preserve some aspect of his lover's beauty and vitality in a form that could survive the destruction of mortal flesh. Unlike his appropriation of Daphne's transformed body as his personal symbol, the creation of hyacinth flowers reflected genuine love and a desire to honour the memory of someone who had brought him authentic happiness. These three relationships, the obsessive pursuit of Daphne, the vindictive punishment of Cassandra, and the tragic loss of Hyacinthus, established a pattern of romantic failure that characterized Apollo's interactions with mortals throughout Greek mythology. The god's divine nature created fundamental incompatibilities with mortal psychology and physiology that made lasting relationships impossible regardless of his intentions or the depth of his feelings. Apollo's immortality meant that even successful relationships would eventually end with his partner's death, creating an inevitable source of grief that coloured all his romantic attachments. His divine power created imbalances that prevented truly equal partnerships, while his status as an Olympian deity carried expectations and responsibilities that interfered with personal relationships. The god's tendency toward possessiveness and his inability to accept rejection reflected psychological patterns that made him unsuitable for the give and take required in healthy romantic relationships. The broader implications of these failed relationships extended beyond Apollo's personal tragedy to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of desire, power, and the relationships between different categories of beings. Greek audiences who heard these stories would have recognized them as cautionary tales about the dangers of pursuing relationships across the boundaries that separated gods from mortals, while also finding in them reflections of their own experiences with unrequited love, romantic obsession, and the grief that accompanied all human attachments. The stories also revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of divine justice and the arbitrary exercise of supernatural power. Apollo's treatment of Daphne and Cassandra demonstrated that even gods associated with civilization and rational behaviour could act in ways that violated their own proclaimed principles when their personal desires were frustrated. The gap between divine claims to moral authority and actual divine behaviour created tensions that Greek religious thought never fully resolved. The romantic failures that marked Apollo's personal relationships stood in stark contrast to his profound influence over matters of life and death through his mastery of both healing and disease. This dual nature represented one of the most complex and psychologically challenging aspects of Apollo's divine portfolio, as the same deity who could cure the most devastating ailments could also unleash plagues that decimated entire populations. The silver arrows that had slain Python became symbols of this terrible duality, capable of bringing swift death through pestilence or miraculous recovery through divine intervention. Ancient Greek understanding of disease differed fundamentally from modern medical concepts, viewing illness as primarily supernatural in origin rather than the result of natural biological processes. When plague struck a community, the immediate assumption was that some deity had been offended and was expressing displeasure through the suffering of mortals. Apollo's association with both the cause and cure of disease made him the most feared and sought-after divine physician, as he alone possessed the authority to end the suffering he had initiated. The god's medical abilities manifested through various mechanisms that reflected different aspects of his divine nature. His prophetic powers enabled him to diagnose ailments by perceiving their supernatural causes and understanding the spiritual imbalances that manifested as physical symptoms. His musical skills provided therapeutic benefits, as certain melodies and rhythmic patterns could influence the harmony between body and soul that the Greeks believed essential for health. His mastery of archery translated into precise control over the invisible arrows of disease, allowing him to target specific individuals or communities with surgical accuracy. Archaeological evidence from Apollo's healing sanctuaries reveals sophisticated medical practices that combined religious ritual with practical therapeutic techniques. These sites, scattered throughout the Greek world, served as the ancient equivalent of hospitals, attracting patients from across the Mediterranean who sought cures that mortal physicians could not provide. The most famous of these sanctuaries was located at Epidaurus in the Peloponnese, though Apollo's healing cult operated dozens of similar facilities from Asia Minor to southern Italy. The typical healing sanctuary featured a complex of buildings designed to accommodate both the religious and practical aspects of divine medical treatment. The central temple housed a cult statue of Apollo, usually depicting him holding a silver bow in one hand and a branch of laurel or healing herbs in the other. This iconography emphasized the god's dual nature as both destroyer and healer, reminding supplicants that the same divine power that could kill could also cure. Adjacent to the main temple stood the abaton, a long colonnade where patients slept while awaiting divine healing through therapeutic dreams. These structures featured stone benches or simple beds where the sick could lie comfortably while temple attendants monitored their condition and interpreted any visions they experienced during their stay. The architecture of these buildings emphasized openness to the natural environment, with large windows and open spaces that allowed fresh air circulation and provided views of sacred groves and springs. The healing process began with elaborate purification rituals that prepared patients to receive divine attention. Supplicants bathed in sacred springs, whose waters were believed to possess curative properties derived from their proximity to Apollo's presence. They offered sacrifices of animals, food, or valuable objects according to their means and the severity of their conditions. Wealthy patients might sacrifice bulls or offer golden vessels, while the poor brought grain, honey, or simple pottery vessels filled with olive oil. The therapeutic dreams that patients experienced in the abaton represented the core of Apollo's healing methodology. These visions, induced through a combination of a religious atmosphere, herbal preparations, and psychological suggestion, provided both diagnostic information and specific treatment recommendations. Patients reported dreams in which Apollo appeared in various forms, sometimes as a handsome young man offering healing herbs, sometimes as a brilliant light that drove away the darkness of disease, and occasionally as a figure who performed symbolic surgical procedures that translated into actual physical improvement. The temple priests who interpreted these dreams possessed extensive training in both religious doctrine and practical medicine. They understood the symbolic language through which Apollo communicated his healing instructions and could translate divine visions into specific therapeutic regimens. These interpretations might include recommendations for dietary changes, exercise routines, herbal medicines, or surgical procedures that addressed both the spiritual and physical aspects of the patient's condition. The development of the Asclepius cult under Apollo's patronage represented a significant evolution in Greek medical practice and religious thought. Asclepius, according to mythological tradition, was Apollo's son by Coronis, a mortal woman whose tragic story illustrated once again the dangerous consequences of romantic involvement with the god. Coronis had been unfaithful to Apollo during her pregnancy, and the god's jealous rage led to her death by Artemis's arrows. However, Apollo rescued the unborn child from his mother's funeral pyre, demonstrating his protective concern for offspring even when their mothers had betrayed him. The infant Asclepius was entrusted to the centaur Chiron, the wisest and most civilized of his species, who possessed unparalleled knowledge of healing herbs and medical techniques. Under Chiron's tutelage, Asclepius developed healing abilities that eventually surpassed even those of his divine father. The young god's medical skills became so advanced that he could resurrect the dead, a power that threatened the fundamental order of existence by violating the boundary between life and death. Zeus's decision to kill Asclepius with a thunderbolt for his excessive healing abilities created a crisis that revealed the complex relationship between divine power and cosmic order. Apollo's rage at his son's death led to the god's temporary exile from Olympus, during which he served as a shepherd to King Admetus of Phaerae. This period of divine punishment and humiliation demonstrated that even the gods were subject to limitations and consequences when their actions disrupted the natural order. However, Asclepius's death did not end his influence on medical practice. Zeus placed the slain healer among the stars as the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, while Apollo established healing sanctuaries where his son's spirit could continue providing medical assistance to mortals. These Asclepiaeons, as they became known, developed sophisticated medical practices that combined religious ritual with empirical observation and practical treatment techniques. The serpent became the primary symbol associated with Asclepius, and by extension with Apollo's healing aspects. These creatures were believed to possess special knowledge of medicinal herbs, as they were often observed eating specific plants that seemed to provide therapeutic benefits. The serpent's ability to shed its skin and emerge renewed made it a powerful symbol of healing and regeneration. Many Asclepiaeons maintained sacred serpents that were allowed to move freely through the healing chambers, their presence believed to enhance the therapeutic atmosphere. The medical practices developed at these sanctuaries influenced the emergence of rational medicine alongside continued reliance on divine intervention. Physicians associated with Apollo's healing cult began systematically observing and recording the symptoms, treatments, and outcomes of various diseases. They developed detailed knowledge of anatomy through their work with surgical patients, and accumulated extensive pharmacological information about the medicinal properties of different plants and minerals. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical texts traditionally attributed to Hippocrates of Kos, reflected this synthesis of religious and rational approaches to healing. While these works emphasized natural causes of disease and empirical treatment methods, they also acknowledged the role of divine influence in both causing and curing illness. The famous Hippocratic Oath included invocations to Apollo, Asclepius, and other healing deities, demonstrating the continued importance of religious elements in medical practice. Apollo's role as a military deity, known by the epithet Paean, represented another crucial aspect of his medical functions. Ancient warfare created enormous demands for healing services, as battles produced large numbers of wounded soldiers who required immediate treatment to survive. The god's association with archery made him a natural patron for warriors, while his medical abilities provided essential support for military campaigns where disease often killed more soldiers than enemy action. The title Paean derived from the victory songs sung after successful battles, hymns that praised Apollo for granting triumph over enemies and healing the wounded. These songs served multiple functions in military contexts. They boosted morale among troops, provided a structured way to process the trauma of combat, and created a sense of divine protection that encouraged soldiers to fight with greater courage and determination. Military commanders routinely consulted Apollo's oracles before launching campaigns, seeking divine guidance about favourable timing, strategic approaches, and potential outcomes. The god's prophetic abilities enabled him to foresee the medical challenges that specific military operations would create, allowing commanders to prepare appropriate supplies of healing herbs, surgical instruments, and trained medical personnel. The practical aspects of Apollo Paean's military medicine involved sophisticated understanding of battlefield trauma and emergency treatment procedures. Temple physicians associated with his cult developed techniques for treating arrow wounds, sword cuts, and spear thrusts that maximized survival rates among wounded soldiers. They understood the importance of rapid treatment for preventing infection and blood loss, and they developed portable medical kits that could be carried on campaign. The psychological aspects of military medicine proved equally important in Apollo's role as Paean, Combat created mental trauma that could disable soldiers as effectively as physical wounds, and the gods' musical abilities provided therapeutic benefits for treating what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress. The rhythmic chanting and melodic hymns performed in his honor helped soldiers process their experiences and reintegrate into civilian life after campaigns ended. Apollo's dual nature as both healer and plague-bringer created complex theological challenges for ancient Greek religious thought. The same deity who could cure diseases could also inflict them, raising difficult questions about divine justice and the arbitrary nature of supernatural power. When plague struck communities, religious authorities had to determine whether the outbreak represented punishment for specific offences or simply the unpredictable exercise of divine will. The opening of Homer's Iliad provided the most famous literary example of Apollo's plague-bringing abilities. When Agamemnon dishonoured Chryses, a priest of Apollo, by refusing to return his captured daughter and insulting his religious authority, the god responded by sending a devastating plague that killed thousands of Greek soldiers besieging Troy. The epidemic began among the army's animals. Mules and dogs died first, followed by the men themselves, as Apollo's silver arrows found their targets with unerring accuracy. Homer's description of the plague emphasized the god's methodical approach to divine punishment. Apollo did not strike randomly, but targeted the Greek camp with precision, ensuring that his arrows affected only those associated with Agamemnon's offense. The epidemic continued for 9 days, long enough to demonstrate divine displeasure, but not so long as to completely destroy the Greek army and prevent the eventual resolution of the conflict. The theological implications of this episode extended beyond simple divine retribution to encompass broader questions about collective responsibility and the relationship between individual actions and community consequences. Agamemnon's personal offence against Apollo's priest brought suffering upon the entire Greek army, demonstrating how the actions of leaders could expose their followers to divine punishment. This principle had significant practical implications for ancient communities, as it emphasized the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the gods through appropriate religious observance. The resolution of the plague required not only the return of Chryses' daughter, but also elaborate religious ceremonies designed to restore proper relationships between the Greeks and Apollo. These rituals included sacrificial offerings, purification ceremonies, and the performance of paeans that acknowledged the god's power and sought his forgiveness for the offence committed against his priest. The development of rational medicine alongside continued belief in divine causation of disease created ongoing tensions in Greek medical practice. Physicians trained in empirical observation and natural treatment methods had to navigate carefully between their scientific understanding and the religious expectations of their patients. Many medical practitioners found ways to integrate both approaches using rational diagnostic techniques while acknowledging the role of divine influence in determining treatment outcomes. The influence of Apollo's medical aspects on Greek culture extended far beyond the boundaries of formal religious practice. The god's emphasis on harmony, balance, and moderation as essential elements of health influenced philosophical schools that sought to understand the relationship between physical and mental well-being. The Pythagoreans, in particular, developed theories about the mathematical relationships that governed both musical harmony and bodily health, seeing in Apollo's dual mastery of music and medicine evidence for underlying cosmic principles. The spread of Apollo's healing cult throughout the Mediterranean world facilitated the exchange of medical knowledge between different cultures and regions. Physicians trained at major Asclepieions carried their expertise to new locations, establishing satellite healing centres that adapted Greek medical practices to local conditions and traditions. This cultural diffusion contributed to the development of more sophisticated medical understanding throughout the ancient world. The economic impact of Apollo's healing sanctuaries proved substantial for the communities that hosted them. These religious centres attracted patients from across the known world, creating demand for lodging, food, transportation, and other services that supported local economies. The wealth generated by medical pilgrimage funded elaborate building projects, supported communities of priests and temple workers, and contributed to the general prosperity of regions blessed with important healing sanctuaries. The integration of military and civilian medical practices under Apollo's patronage created a comprehensive approach to healthcare that addressed both emergency trauma treatment and long-term therapeutic needs. But this represented only one facet of the god's broader influence on Greek civilization. Apollo's role as patron of the arts extended far beyond his personal musical competitions and romantic tragedies to encompass the systematic development of cultural institutions that would define Greek intellectual life for centuries. His leadership of the Nine Muses established him as the supreme arbiter of all artistic endeavours, while his influence on education, architecture, and civic planning created the framework within which Greek culture achieved its remarkable flowering. The Nine Muses, daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, served as Apollo's primary agents for inspiring human creativity across multiple artistic domains. Each muse governed a specific area of cultural expression, but their collective work under Apollo's direction created a unified approach to artistic education that emphasized the interconnection between different forms of creative activity. Calliope presided over epic poetry and eloquence, her voice capable of inspiring the lengthy narrative works that preserved mythological traditions and heroic legends. Clio governed history and historical writing, ensuring that human achievements and failures were recorded accurately for future generations. Erato controlled lyric poetry and love songs, while Euterpe supervised music and the playing of wind instruments. Melpomene's domain encompassed tragedy and theatrical performance, her influence extending to the dramatic festivals that became central features of Greek religious and civic life. Polyhymnia governed sacred poetry and religious hymns, maintaining the connection between artistic expression and divine worship. Terpsichore controlled dance and choral performance, organising the complex choreographic traditions that accompanied religious ceremonies and public celebrations. Thalia supervised comedy and pastoral poetry, providing balance to the more serious artistic forms through humour and rustic charm. Urania governed astronomy and astronomical poetry, linking artistic inspiration to scientific observation and mathematical understanding. Apollo's coordination of the Muses' activities created a comprehensive educational system that viewed artistic training as essential preparation for civic participation and intellectual development. This approach, known as musicae, encompassed far more than modern concepts of music education. It included training in poetry composition, mathematical relationships, historical knowledge, and the performance skills necessary for participating in religious ceremonies and public festivals. Young Greeks from aristocratic families received extensive instruction in these subjects, as mastery of artistic skills was considered essential for achieving social prominence and political influence. The god's influence on epic poetry proved particularly significant for the preservation and transmission of Greek cultural values. The Iliad and Odyssey, traditionally attributed to Homer, reflected Apollo's aesthetic principles through their emphasis on formal structure, mathematical precision in meter and rhythm, and the integration of divine and human action within coherent narrative frameworks. These works served as foundational texts for Greek education, providing models of heroic behaviour while demonstrating the literary techniques that characterized the highest levels of artistic achievement. Apollo's role in inspiring these epic compositions extended beyond simple artistic patronage to encompass active participation in their creation and dissemination. The god's prophetic abilities enabled him to foresee which stories would resonate most powerfully with future audiences, while his musical expertise ensured that the poem's rhythmic and melodic structures would facilitate memorization and oral transmission. The bardic tradition that preserved these works relied heavily on performance techniques associated with Apollo's worship, including the use of stringed instruments to accompany recitation and the integration of musical interludes that enhanced the emotional impact of key narrative moments. The development of musical theory under Apollo's patronage established principles that influenced both artistic practice and broader intellectual understanding throughout the Greek world. The god's traditional association with the seven-stringed lyre provided a foundation for mathematical investigations into the relationships between musical intervals and numerical ratios. Pythagorean philosophers, working within the intellectual framework established by Apollo's musical teachings, discovered that pleasing harmonies corresponded to simple mathematical relationships between string lengths, leading to broader theories about the mathematical structure of reality itself. The lyre's construction reflected sophisticated understanding of acoustic principles that developed through centuries of refinement under divine guidance. The instrument's wooden body, typically crafted from cedar or maple, was designed to resonate at specific frequencies that complemented the human voice. The 7 strings, made from sheep gut or twisted plant fibers, were tuned according to mathematical relationships that created harmonic intervals pleasing to Greek aesthetic sensibilities. Advanced players could achieve complex musical effects by varying string tension, using different plucking techniques, and coordinating instrumental performance with vocal delivery. Regional variations in lyre construction reflected local preferences and available materials, while maintaining the basic structural principles that Apollo had established. Instruments from Asia Minor featured elaborate decorative inlays and precious metal fittings that demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of their owners. Spartan lyres emphasized functional simplicity over ornamental display, reflecting the culture's values of military efficiency and disdain for excessive luxury. Athenian instruments often incorporated innovative technical features that improved tonal quality or expanded the range of achievable effects. The integration of musical training with mathematical education created educational approaches that viewed artistic skill and intellectual development as complementary rather than competing objectives. Students learned to calculate the numerical relationships that governed harmonic intervals, while simultaneously developing the manual dexterity and auditory sensitivity required for skilled performance. This combination of theoretical knowledge and practical ability produced graduates who understood both the technical and aesthetic aspects of musical composition and performance. Apollo's influence on architectural development manifested through his patronage of temple construction and urban planning projects that established aesthetic principles governing public building throughout the Greek world. The god's temples served as laboratories for architectural experimentation, where builders tested new techniques for achieving the mathematical proportions and visual harmony that characterize classical Greek architecture. These structures demonstrated how divine aesthetic principles could be translated into practical building methods that created spaces suitable for both religious worship and civic activities. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi exemplified the architectural principles that the god promoted through his patronage of building projects. The structure's proportions reflected mathematical relationships derived from musical theory, with columns spacing, roof angles, and interior dimensions calculated according to ratios that created visual harmony analogous to musical consonants. The building's orientation aligned with astronomical phenomena associated with Apollo's solar aspects, ensuring that sunlight would illuminate the interior spaces at symbolically significant moments during religious ceremonies. The development of the Doric order under Apollo's influence established architectural conventions that spread throughout the Greek world and influenced building practices for centuries. The order's emphasis on structural clarity, mathematical proportion, and restrained ornamentation reflected the god's aesthetic values of balance, moderation, and rational organization. Doric columns featured simple, unadorned capitals that emphasized the structural function of supporting the building's weight while maintaining visual elegance through carefully calculated proportional relationships. The integration of sculptural decoration with architectural design created building programs that communicated complex theological and political messages through visual imagery. Apollo's temples featured sculptural programs that depicted the god's mythological exploits while simultaneously promoting civic values and religious devotion. The pediments typically showed scenes of divine triumph over chaotic forces, reinforcing messages about the victory of civilization over barbarism and order over disorder. Metopes and friezes depicted related mythological episodes that expanded these themes while demonstrating the artistic skills of local sculptors and craftsmen. Urban planning principles developed under Apollo's patronage emphasized the creation of public spaces that facilitated both religious observance and civic participation. The god's aesthetic values influenced the design of agorae, theatres, and gymnasia that served as focal points for community life in Greek cities. These spaces were designed according to mathematical principles that created visual harmony while accommodating the practical requirements of large public gatherings and ceremonial activities. The Theatre of Dionysus at Athens demonstrated how Apollo's architectural principles could be adapted for structures dedicated to other deities while maintaining aesthetic coherence within the broader urban environment. The building's semicircular seating arrangement followed mathematical curves that ensured optimal acoustics and sightlines for all spectators, while its integration with the surrounding sacred precinct created a unified architectural composition that enhanced both theatrical performance and religious ceremony. The development of the gymnasium as an architectural type reflected Apollo's influence on educational practices and his emphasis on the integration of physical and intellectual training. These complexes featured courtyards for athletic activities, lecture halls for philosophical instruction, and libraries for scholarly research, all designed according to proportional systems that created harmonious relationships between different functional areas. The building's layouts facilitated the movement between different types of educational activities while maintaining appropriate spaces for both group instruction and individual study. Apollo's connection to the broader Greek concept of paideia represented perhaps his most significant contribution to ancient civilization. This educational philosophy viewed cultural refinement as essential for human development and civic participation, emphasizing the cultivation of artistic sensitivity, intellectual capability, and moral character through systematic training in various cultural disciplines. The god's patronage of the arts provided the theoretical foundation for educational practices that sought to develop well-rounded individuals capable of contributing meaningfully to community life. The paideia system integrated musical training, literary education, mathematical instruction, and physical conditioning within a comprehensive curriculum that prepared students for adult responsibilities in Greek society. Apollo's influence ensured that artistic subjects received equal emphasis with more practical skills, as cultural sophistication was considered essential for effective leadership and civic participation. Students learned to appreciate the mathematical relationships underlying musical harmony, the historical traditions preserved in epic poetry, and the aesthetic principles governing architectural design and sculptural composition. The gymnasium served as the primary institutional setting for paideia education, providing facilities for both physical training and intellectual instruction under the patronage of various deities including Apollo. These institutions attracted students from across the Greek world, creating networks of shared cultural knowledge and artistic appreciation that facilitated communication and cooperation between different city-states. The friendships and intellectual connections formed in gymnasium settings often lasted throughout participants' lives, creating informal networks that supported trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The influence of Apollo's educational philosophy extended beyond formal institutional settings to encompass broader patterns of cultural transmission and social organisation. Aristocratic families invested heavily in their children's artistic education, hiring private tutors who specialised in musical performance, poetic composition, and other cultural skills associated with the god's patronage. These educational investments created social distinctions based on cultural sophistication rather than merely economic wealth. As demonstrated, mastery of artistic skills became a marker of elite status and social refinement. The development of competitive festivals under Apollo's patronage provided public venues for demonstrating educational achievements while reinforcing community values and religious devotion. The Pythian Games at Delphi featured musical and poetic competitions alongside athletic events, creating opportunities for young Greeks to display their cultural accomplishments before audiences that included representatives from cities throughout the Mediterranean world. Success in these competitions brought prestige to both individual performers and their home communities, encouraging continued investment in artistic education and cultural development. The influence of Apollo's aesthetic principles on Greek material culture extended beyond monumental architecture and formal artistic production to encompass everyday objects and domestic spaces. Pottery decoration, textile patterns, metalwork designs, and furniture construction all reflected the mathematical proportions and visual harmonies that the god promoted through his patronage of the arts. This widespread application of divine aesthetic principles created a unified visual culture that reinforced Greek identity and cultural values through constant exposure to harmonious design relationships. The economic implications of Apollo's cultural patronage proved substantial for communities throughout the Greek world. The demand for skilled artists, musicians, architects, and craftsmen created employment opportunities that supported specialized trades and encouraged the development of technical expertise. Cities competed to attract talented individuals who could enhance their cultural reputation and contribute to ambitious building projects that demonstrated civic prosperity and divine favour. The international reach of Apollo's cultural influence facilitated the spread of Greek artistic techniques and aesthetic principles throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. But it was during the Trojan War that the god's complex relationship with human civilization reached its most dramatic and consequential expression. Apollo's partisan support for Troy transformed what might have been a localized conflict into a cosmic struggle that revealed the arbitrary nature of divine justice and the devastating consequences of celestial politics on mortal affairs. Apollo's affection for Troy stemmed from multiple sources that combined personal attachment, religious obligation, and political calculation. The city's wealth and sophistication impressed even divine observers, as Troy commanded the crucial trade routes between Europe and Asia while maintaining cultural standards that rivaled those of the greatest Greek cities. The massive walls that surrounded the urban centre, constructed with divine assistance from Poseidon and Apollo himself during their temporary exile from Olympus, represented architectural achievements that demonstrated both human ambition and divine craftsmanship working in harmony. The Trojan royal family had maintained particularly close relationships with Apollo through generations of faithful worship and generous offerings. King Priam's devotion to the god included the construction of a magnificent temple within the citadel, its golden roof visible from ships approaching the Hellespont. The building housed a cult statue crafted from ivory and precious metals, depicting Apollo in his role as city protector with a silver bow in one hand and a laurel branch in the other. Daily sacrifices of bulls and sheep demonstrated the royal family's commitment to maintaining divine favour, while annual festivals celebrating Apollo's victory over Python drew pilgrims from across Asia Minor. Paris, despite his role in precipitating the war through his abduction of Helen, remained under Apollo's special protection due to his exceptional skill with the bow and his dedication to the god's worship. The prince's marksmanship had been honed through years of training in the mountains around Troy, where he had served as a shepherd before his royal identity was revealed. Apollo had personally instructed Paris in advanced archery techniques, teaching him to account for wind conditions, target movement, and the psychological factors that affected accuracy under combat stress. This divine tutelage made Paris one of the most formidable archers in the ancient world, capable of striking targets at distances that challenged even experienced warriors. Hector, the eldest prince and Troy's greatest defender, embodied the heroic virtues that Apollo most admired in mortal men. The prince's combination of physical prowess, tactical intelligence, and moral integrity created a character that seemed to justify divine favoritism through demonstrated excellence, rather than mere political convenience. Hector's leadership of the Trojan forces reflected strategic thinking that maximized his army's defensive advantages while minimizing unnecessary casualties, demonstrating the kind of rational approach to warfare that Apollo promoted through his civilizing influence. The god's protection of Hector manifested through various forms of battlefield intervention that kept the prince alive through numerous encounters with Greek champions. Apollo deflected spears that would have penetrated Hector's armour, caused enemy chariots to overturn at crucial moments, and created dust clouds that concealed Trojan movements during tactical withdrawals. These interventions required careful timing and subtle application of divine power, as overly obvious assistance would have provoked counter-intervention from pro-Greek deities and potentially escalated the conflict beyond acceptable limits. The complex web of divine alliances during the Trojan War created a celestial parallel to the human conflict that often determined the outcome of specific battles and strategic decisions. Hera's hatred of Troy, stemming from Paris's judgment in the beauty contest that awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, ensured that the queen of the gods would support any effort to destroy the city, regardless of the justice of the Greek cause. Athena's alliance with the Greeks reflected her rivalry with Aphrodite, and her preference for the disciplined warfare practiced by Greek armies over the more individualistic fighting styles favoured by Trojan warriors. Poseidon's opposition to Troy created particular complications for Apollo, as the sea god's anger stemmed from King Laomedon's refusal to pay the promised wages for constructing the city's walls. This personal grievance between Poseidon and the Trojan royal family placed Apollo in the difficult position of defending a city against a deity who had legitimate complaints about Trojan honour and contractual obligations. The situation demonstrated how past injustices could influence divine politics for generations, creating conflicts that transcended the immediate issues that sparked human wars. Aphrodite's support for Paris and Troy reflected her role in initiating the conflict through her promise of Helen's love, but her military contributions proved limited by her lack of experience with warfare and her vulnerability to physical injury. When Diomedes wounded the goddess during her attempt to rescue her son Aeneas from battle, her withdrawal from active combat left Troy increasingly dependent on Apollo's protection. This incident revealed the limitations of divine intervention in mortal conflicts, as even goddesses could be neutralized by skilled and determined human warriors. The plague that Apollo sent against the Greek army in response to Agamemnon's insult to Chryses represented one of the most dramatic examples of divine intervention in the war's early stages. The epidemic began with surgical precision, targeting the Greek camp's animals before spreading to the human population in a pattern that demonstrated divine rather than natural causation. Mules and dogs collapsed first, their bodies covering the beaches around the Greek ships as the invisible arrows of pestilence found their marks with unerring accuracy. The progression of the plague followed a methodical timeline that maximized its psychological impact on Greek morale, while providing clear evidence of its supernatural origin. For 3 days, only animals died, creating an atmosphere of dread as the Greeks watched their livestock succumb to an invisible enemy. The systematic nature of these deaths, with healthy animals collapsing suddenly without apparent cause, eliminated any possibility that the Greeks might attribute the epidemic to natural factors or poor sanitation in their crowded camp. When the plague began affecting human victims, its symptoms defied conventional medical understanding and resisted all attempts at treatment. Victims developed high fevers that consumed their strength within hours, accompanied by painful swellings that appeared at random locations on their bodies. The disease showed no respect for rank or military experience, striking veteran warriors and raw recruits with equal severity. Greek physicians trained in traditional healing methods found their remedies completely ineffective, while prayers to other deities brought no relief from the supernatural affliction. The epidemic's duration of 9 days carried symbolic significance that reinforced its connection to divine justice rather than random misfortune. 9 represented completion and perfection in Greek numerical symbolism, suggesting that Apollo's punishment would continue until the offence against his priest received appropriate redress. The precision of this timeline demonstrated the god's complete control over the plague's progression and his willingness to calibrate divine punishment to match the severity of the original insult. Agamemnon's initial refusal to return Chryseis to her father revealed the Greek leader's fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between divine authority and mortal power. The king's dismissal of Chryseis reflected his belief that military success had placed him beyond the reach of divine retribution, a hubris that Apollo found particularly offensive given the priest's humble demeanour and legitimate request for his daughter's return. The god's response demonstrated that no amount of human achievement could protect mortals from divine justice when they violated the sacred obligations that governed relationships between gods and their servants. The economic impact of the plague on Greek military operations extended far beyond the immediate casualties it inflicted. Dead animals could not transport supplies or provide food for the army, while sick soldiers required care that diverted resources from military activities. The Greeks found themselves forced to conduct elaborate funeral rites for unprecedented numbers of dead, consuming time and materials that should have been devoted to prosecuting the siege of Troy. The constant presence of funeral pyres created a psychological atmosphere that undermined confidence in the expedition's eventual success. The resolution of the plague crisis required not only the return of Chryseis, but also elaborate religious ceremonies designed to restore proper relationships between the Greeks and Apollo. These rituals included the sacrifice of a hecatomb, 100 cattle offered to demonstrate the Greeks' recognition of divine authority and their commitment to avoiding future offences against the god's servants. The animals chosen for this sacrifice had to meet strict standards of perfection, with unblemished hides and healthy appearance that made them worthy offerings to an Olympian deity. The religious ceremonies accompanying the hecatomb involved the entire Greek army in acknowledgement of collective responsibility for their leader's offence. Soldiers participated in purification rituals that cleansed them of the pollution associated with the plague, while elaborate hymns praised Apollo's mercy in ending the epidemic. These paeans served multiple functions beyond simple religious observance, as they provided psychological healing for troops traumatized by the supernatural attack and reinforced military discipline through shared participation in religious duty. The prophetic warnings that Apollo delivered through various oracles about the war's ultimate outcome created additional layers of complexity in the divine politics surrounding the conflict. The god's foresight revealed that Troy's destruction was inevitable regardless of his personal preferences, creating a tragic situation where his protection of individual Trojans could only delay rather than prevent their eventual doom. This knowledge influenced Apollo's strategic decisions throughout the war, as he focused on preserving specific individuals like Aeneas, who would play crucial roles in post-war developments, rather than attempting to save the city itself. The Oracle at Delphi provided cryptic guidance to both Greek and Trojan representatives seeking divine insight into the war's progress and likely outcomes. These prophecies required careful interpretation, as Apollo's messages often contained multiple layers of meaning that became clear only after subsequent events had unfolded. The god's prophetic communications served to maintain his reputation for accuracy, while avoiding direct contradiction of Zeus's ultimate plans for the conflict's resolution. The psychological impact of these prophetic warnings on both armies created additional complications for military commanders, trying to maintain morale and discipline. Soldiers who learned of prophecies predicting their side's eventual defeat faced the challenge of continuing to fight effectively while knowing that their efforts might ultimately prove futile. Conversely, warriors who received favourable predictions sometimes became overconfident, leading to tactical mistakes that negated the advantages their divine favour should have provided. Apollo's influence on the war's conduct extended beyond direct military intervention to encompass the cultural and religious dimensions of the conflict. The god's patronage of poetry ensured that the war's events would be preserved in epic verse that emphasized heroic values and divine justice over a mere military success. This literary framework transformed what might have been remembered as a simple territorial dispute into a foundational narrative about the relationship between human ambition and divine will. The development of heroic poetry during and after the Trojan War reflected Apollo's aesthetic principles through its emphasis on formal structure, mathematical precision in meter, and the integration of divine and human action within coherent narrative frameworks. The god's influence on bardic composition ensured that the war's literary representation would emphasize themes of honor, duty, and the consequences of hubris, rather than focusing solely on military tactics or political calculations. The post-war consequences that Apollo's prophetic abilities revealed created additional motivations for his intervention in specific battles and strategic situations. The god's foresight showed him the chain of events that would lead from Troy's destruction to the founding of Rome through Aeneas's descendants, making the survival of certain Trojan heroes essential for future historical developments. This knowledge influenced Apollo's protective actions throughout the war, as he worked to ensure that key figures would survive to fulfill their destined roles in subsequent events. The psychological burden of possessing complete knowledge about the war's outcome, while being unable to prevent its tragic conclusion, created internal conflicts for Apollo that manifested through his increasingly desperate attempts to protect individual Trojans. But these efforts would soon pale in comparison to the personal crisis that awaited him following the war's end. The chain of events that led to Apollo's temporary exile from Olympus began with Zeus's decision to strike down Asclepius, Apollo's son, whose healing abilities had grown so powerful that he could resurrect the dead. This violation of the fundamental boundary between life and death threatened the cosmic order that Zeus was sworn to maintain, making the young god's destruction a necessity despite Apollo's paternal feelings. Apollo's rage at his son's death burned with an intensity that surprised even the other Olympian deities. The god who had accepted countless disappointments in love and numerous challenges to his authority found himself unable to contain his fury at what he perceived as Zeus's arbitrary exercise of power. Asclepius had committed no crime beyond excessive compassion, using his divine gifts to heal mortals who suffered from ailments that conventional medicine could not address. The young god's ability to restore life represented the ultimate expression of Apollo's own healing domain, making Zeus's intervention feel like a personal attack on Apollo's divine portfolio and paternal authority. The Cyclops who had forged Zeus's thunderbolts became the targets of Apollo's vengeance, as the god reasoned that destroying the weapon's creators would prevent future arbitrary executions of his children or followers. These ancient beings, Brontes, Sterapes and Arges, had served Zeus faithfully since the Titanomachy, crafting not only the thunderbolts but also Poseidon's trident and Hades' helmet of invisibility. Their workshop deep within Mount Etna had become a symbol of divine technological superiority, producing weapons that maintained the Olympians' dominance over older generations of deities and supernatural beings. Apollo's assault on the Cyclops required careful planning and precise execution, as these beings possessed both divine status and formidable defensive capabilities. The god approached their volcanic fortress with his silver bow drawn, its arrows gleaming with the deadly light that had once slain Python. The Cyclops, absorbed in their eternal labour of forging divine weapons, initially failed to notice Apollo's approach through the sulphurous caverns that led to their workshop. The constant din of their hammering against divine metals masked the sound of the gods' footsteps on the rocky passages. Bronte fell first, struck through the heart by an arrow that penetrated his bronze-hard skin with supernatural force. The eldest Cyclops had been examining a half-finished thunderbolt when Apollo's missile found its mark, causing him to collapse across his anvil as divine ichor flowed from the wound. Steropes and Arges turned at the sound of their brother's death throes, but Apollo's archery skills allowed him to loose 2 more arrows in rapid succession before either could reach for defensive weapons. The workshop fell silent for the first time in millennia as the 3 bodies cooled among the tools and materials of their trade. Zeus's discovery of the Cyclops' deaths triggered a confrontation that shook the foundations of Olympus itself. The king of the gods had relied on these ancient beings, not merely for their weapon-crafting abilities, but as symbols of the technological advancement that distinguished his reign from the chaotic rule of earlier divine generations. Their destruction represented both a practical loss and a symbolic challenge to Zeus's authority that could not be overlooked without encouraging similar acts of rebellion from other Olympian deities. The punishment Zeus decreed for Apollo's crime reflected both divine justice and political necessity. Rather than destroying his son outright, which would have created a dangerous precedent for resolving disputes among Olympian deities, Zeus chose temporary exile as a penalty that demonstrated his authority while preserving family relationships essential for maintaining cosmic stability. Apollo would be stripped of his divine privileges and compelled to serve a mortal master for 1 full year, experiencing the limitations and vulnerabilities that defined human existence. King Admetus of Pherae and Thessaly became Apollo's designated master, though the mortal ruler initially had no knowledge of his new servant's true identity. Zeus had transformed Apollo's appearance to that of a sturdy young man of common birth, with calloused hands that suggested familiarity with manual labour and simple clothing that marked him as a member of the working class. The god's golden hair had been darkened to brown, his divine radiance dimmed to the ordinary glow of mortal health, and his perfect features slightly weathered to suggest years of outdoor work. The experience of mortality struck Apollo with devastating force during his first days in Pherae. The god who had never known hunger found himself genuinely affected by the need for regular meals, while the requirement for sleep created periods of vulnerability that he had never previously experienced. Physical fatigue from shepherding duties left his muscles aching in ways that divine flesh had never endured, while exposure to rain and cold created discomforts that challenged his understanding of bodily existence. Admetus proved to be an unexpectedly worthy master, whose character gradually earned Apollo's genuine respect and affection. The young king demonstrated the kind of moral integrity and compassionate leadership that Apollo had always claimed to value, but rarely encountered in his interactions with mortal rulers. Admetus treated his servants fairly, providing adequate food and shelter while maintaining reasonable expectations for their work performance. His personal conduct reflected the virtues of justice, moderation, and piety that Apollo promoted through his religious teachings. The king's daily routine revealed a commitment to responsible governance that impressed even Apollo's divine sensibilities. Admetus rose before dawn to inspect his livestock personally, checking for signs of disease or injury that might require immediate attention. He participated in the physical labour required to maintain his estates, working alongside his servants in the fields and pastures, rather than simply issuing orders from a position of aristocratic detachment. His evenings were spent reviewing legal disputes, planning agricultural improvements, and consulting with advisors about matters affecting his kingdom's welfare. Apollo's assigned duties as a shepherd initially seemed beneath his dignity, but the god gradually discovered unexpected satisfactions in the work's rhythms and responsibilities. The daily routine of leading flocks to pasture, monitoring their grazing, and protecting them from predators provided a structured existence that contrasted sharply with the often chaotic demands of divine responsibilities. The sheep and goats under his care responded to his presence with the instinctive recognition that marked his continued divine nature, even in its diminished state. The solitary hours spent watching over grazing animals created opportunities for reflection that Apollo had rarely experienced during his active divine career. The god found himself contemplating the relationships between power and responsibility, the nature of justice, and the value of individual lives in ways that his previous existence had not encouraged. The sight of lambs playing in spring meadows, the protective behaviour of ewes toward their young, and the simple contentment of animals living according to their natural patterns provided lessons about existence that divine philosophy had not adequately addressed. The changing seasons during Apollo's year of service created a temporal framework that deepened his understanding of mortal experience. The god who had previously viewed time as an abstract concept found himself intimately connected to the agricultural cycles that governed human survival. Spring brought the exhausting work of lambing season, when Apollo spent sleepless nights assisting difficult births and protecting newborns from predators. Summer's heat created challenges for maintaining adequate water supplies and finding suitable grazing areas during the hottest parts of each day. Autumn's harvest activities required Apollo to participate in the communal labour that brought entire communities together for essential agricultural work. The god found himself working alongside farmers, craftsmen, and other servants in the cooperative effort required to gather and process the crops that would sustain the population through winter. These experiences provided direct knowledge of the interdependence that characterized human society, as Apollo witnessed how individual survival depended on collective effort and mutual support. Winter's hardships tested Apollo's endurance in ways that divine existence had never required. The god experienced genuine cold for the first time, feeling the bite of mountain winds and the numbing effects of snow on exposed skin. The challenge of keeping livestock alive during harsh weather required constant vigilance and creative problem-solving, as Apollo learned to construct windbreaks, locate sheltered grazing areas, and supplement natural forage with stored feed during periods when pasture was unavailable. The relationships Apollo developed with his fellow servants revealed aspects of human nature that his divine perspective had previously overlooked. These men and women, drawn from various backgrounds and circumstances, demonstrated resilience, humour, and mutual loyalty despite their humble social status. Their conversations around evening fires provided Apollo with insights into mortal concerns about family relationships, economic security, and hopes for the future that divine observation had not adequately conveyed. The god's gradual integration into this community of workers created emotional connections that challenged his understanding of the proper relationships between divine and mortal beings. He found himself genuinely caring about the welfare of individuals whose names he had learned, whose personal struggles he had witnessed, and whose friendship he had earned through shared labour and common experiences. These relationships forced Apollo to confront the arbitrary nature of the social hierarchies that elevated some mortals to positions of power while relegating others to lives of service and obscurity. Admetus's marriage to Alcestis during Apollo's period of service provided the god with intimate observation of human love and domestic relationships. The royal wedding celebrations revealed the complex social and political negotiations that surrounded aristocratic marriages, but they also demonstrated the genuine affection that developed between the young king and his bride. Apollo witnessed their daily interactions as they adjusted to married life, learning to balance personal desires with royal responsibilities while maintaining the mutual respect and emotional intimacy that characterize successful partnerships. The god's protective influence over Admetus's household manifested in subtle ways that enhanced the king's prosperity without revealing Apollo's divine identity. Livestock under the god's care remained unusually healthy, producing abundant milk and wool while avoiding the diseases and accidents that typically affected pastoral operations. the king's flocks multiplied at remarkable rates, as Apollo's presence encouraged successful breeding and protected young animals from predators and harsh weather. These improvements in Admetus's agricultural operations created economic prosperity that enhanced the king's political position and enabled him to provide better conditions for his subjects. The increased wealth allowed for improvements in roads, public buildings, and defensive fortifications that strengthened the kingdom's security and attracted additional settlers and traders. Apollo's disguised service thus created a cycle of improvement that demonstrated how divine favour could enhance human achievement when properly applied. The completion of Apollo's year of service coincided with a crisis that tested both his commitment to his mortal master and his understanding of divine justice. When the fates decreed that Admetus would die young unless someone volunteered to take his place, Apollo found himself in a position to influence events through knowledge gained during his period of exile. The god's intimate understanding of the king's character and the genuine affection he had developed for Admetus motivated him to seek a solution that would preserve both justice and compassion. Apollo's intervention in this crisis required delicate negotiation with the fates themselves, as he sought to modify their decree without violating the cosmic principles that governed life and death. The god's arguments emphasized Admetus's virtue and the positive influence his continued life would have on his subjects and kingdom. The compromise that emerged allowed for the substitution Apollo had requested, while maintaining the fate's authority over mortal destiny. The revelation of Apollo's true identity to Admetus came only after the resolution of the crisis, as the god prepared to resume his divine status and return to Olympus. The king's reaction to this disclosure demonstrated the wisdom and humility that had earned Apollo's respect during their year together. Rather than expressing anger at the deception or demanding additional favours, Admetus simply thanked his divine servant for the lessons in leadership and character that their relationship had provided. The transformation that Apollo underwent during his exile extended far beyond simple appreciation for mortal struggles and achievements. The god's direct experience of physical vulnerability, economic dependence, and social subordination had fundamentally altered his understanding of the relationship between power and responsibility. He returned to Olympus with a more nuanced appreciation for the complexity of human motivation and the difficulty of making ethical choices under conditions of limited information and constrained resources. This newfound empathy influenced Apollo's subsequent interactions with mortals in ways that distinguished his post-exile behaviour from his earlier divine career. The god became more patient with human failings, more generous in his interpretation of ambiguous situations, and more willing to provide guidance rather than simply demanding obedience. His oracular pronouncements began to emphasize practical wisdom and moral development rather than cryptic warnings about fate and divine displeasure. The architectural project that followed Apollo's return to divine status provided an opportunity to apply the insights gained during his exile to a practical demonstration of divine-mortal cooperation. King Laomedon of Troy had commissioned both Poseidon and Apollo to construct massive walls around his city, offering substantial payment for their services. This arrangement represented an unusual opportunity for gods to work alongside mortal craftsmen in a project that would benefit human civilization while demonstrating divine architectural capabilities. The construction of Troy's walls required coordination between divine power and human skill that created new models for collaboration between different orders of beings. Apollo and Poseidon provided the supernatural strength necessary to move massive stone blocks and the architectural knowledge needed to design fortifications that could withstand both conventional siege warfare and supernatural attacks. Mortal craftsmen contributed specialized techniques for stone cutting, mortar preparation, and decorative work that enhanced both the walls' functionality and their aesthetic appeal. The working relationship that developed between the divine architects and their human colleagues reflected the lessons Apollo had learned during his service to Admetus. The god treated mortal workers with respect and consideration, acknowledging their expertise in areas where divine knowledge proved insufficient. This collaborative approach produced innovations in construction technique and architectural design that benefited both the immediate project and future building efforts throughout the region. The walls themselves represented a masterpiece of defensive architecture that combined practical military considerations with aesthetic principles derived from Apollo's artistic patronage. The fortifications rose to heights that made scaling impossible for conventional armies while maintaining proportional relationships that created visual harmony despite their massive scale. Guard towers positioned at regular intervals provided observation points and defensive positions while contributing to the wall's overall architectural composition. The betrayal that followed the wall's completion revealed the persistence of human moral failings despite divine generosity and collaborative effort. Laomedon's refusal to pay the agreed wages for the construction work demonstrated the kind of contractual dishonesty that Apollo had witnessed during his mortal service, but had hoped to transcend through divine human partnership. The king's calculation that gods would not pursue legal remedies for breach of contract reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of divine psychology and the importance of honor in supernatural relationships. Poseidon's immediate anger at this betrayal contrasted with Apollo's more measured response, as the god drew upon his recent experiences with human complexity to consider possible explanations for Laomedon's behaviour. Perhaps the king faced financial difficulties that made payment impossible, or political pressures that required him to retain resources for other essential purposes. Apollo's willingness to consider these possibilities reflected his enhanced understanding of the constraints that limited mortal decision-making and the multiple factors that influenced human behaviour. However, investigation revealed that Laomedon's refusal to pay stemmed from simple greed and contempt for divine authority, rather than legitimate financial constraints or political necessities. The king possessed abundant resources to fulfill his contractual obligations, but chose to retain them for personal use, rather than honouring his agreements with the gods who had provided valuable services. This discovery forced Apollo to confront the reality that some human failings could not be excused through empathy or understanding, as they reflected fundamental character flaws that required appropriate consequences. The curse that Apollo and Poseidon jointly pronounced upon Troy established a pattern of divine retribution that would influence the city's fate for generations. But the god's relationship with mortal civilization was destined to undergo its most profound transformation through his adoption by Roman religion. The Romans encountered Apollo not as a foreign deity requiring integration into their existing pantheon, but as a sophisticated divine figure whose attributes complemented and enhanced their imperial ambitions. Unlike their typical practice of identifying foreign gods with existing Roman counterparts, the Romans adopted Apollo virtually unchanged, recognizing that his combination of prophetic authority, cultural refinement, and civilizing influence offered precisely what their expanding empire required. The initial Roman contact with Apollo's worship occurred through Greek colonies in southern Italy and Sicily, where established cult sites provided models for religious practices that could be adapted to Roman sensibilities. The Temple of Apollo at Cumae, with its famous Sibyl, who delivered prophecies in Greek hexameter verse, demonstrated the practical benefits that Apollonian religion could provide to a militaristic society facing constant decisions about territorial expansion and military campaigns. Roman commanders consulting this oracle received guidance that proved remarkably accurate, creating a reputation for divine reliability that impressed pragmatic Roman minds more than abstract theological arguments. The plague of 433 BC that devastated Rome provided the decisive moment for Apollo's formal introduction into the Roman religious system. Traditional Roman religious practices, centered on the worship of Jupiter, Mars, and other indigenous deities, proved inadequate for addressing this supernatural crisis that killed thousands of citizens and threatened the survival of the growing city-state. The Roman Senate, following the recommendation of the Sibylline books, authorized the construction of Rome's first temple dedicated to Apollo, marking the beginning of a relationship that would fundamentally reshape both Roman religion and the god's own identity. The location chosen for this initial temple reflected careful consideration of both practical and symbolic factors that would influence Apollo's integration into Roman civic life. The site on the Campus Martius, outside the sacred boundary of the city proper, but within easy reach of the Forum and other centres of political activity, allowed for the construction of a substantial complex without violating religious restrictions governing the placement of foreign temples. The position also provided space for the large gatherings that would characterise Roman religious festivals while maintaining appropriate separation from the most sacred areas reserved for traditional Roman deities. The architectural design of Apollo's first Roman temple incorporated Greek proportional systems and decorative elements within a structural framework that reflected distinctly Roman engineering capabilities and aesthetic preferences. The building featured the elevated podium characteristic of Roman temple design, raising the structure above its surroundings and requiring visitors to ascend a dramatic flight of steps that emphasized the temple's importance. The interior spaces were designed to accommodate Roman religious practices, including the consultation of written oracles and the performance of elaborate sacrificial ceremonies involving large numbers of animals and participants. The cult statue housed within this temple represented a synthesis of Greek artistic traditions with Roman political symbolism that established patterns for subsequent representations of Apollo throughout the empire. The figure depicted the god as an eternally youthful male of idealized proportions, holding a lyre in his left hand, while his right hand extended in a gesture of blessing or prophecy. The statue's face combined the classical Greek emphasis on mathematical harmony with distinctly Roman features that suggested authority and gravitas, creating an image that appealed to both aesthetic sensibilities and political values. The integration of Greek oracular traditions with Roman political needs required significant adaptations that transformed both the methods of prophetic consultation and the interpretation of divine responses. Roman officials approaching Apollo's oracle brought questions that reflected the practical concerns of imperial administration rather than the personal or local issues that had dominated Greek religious practice. They sought guidance about military campaigns in distant territories, the advisability of specific legislative proposals, and the proper responses to omens and portents that might affect state security. The Sibylline books, a collection of prophetic texts allegedly purchased from the Cumaean Sibyl during the reign of Tarquin the Proud, became the primary mechanism through which Apollo's guidance reached Roman decision-makers. These documents, written in Greek verse and stored in a special chamber beneath the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, could only be consulted by a college of priests specifically appointed for this purpose. The books contained cryptic prophecies that required careful interpretation and cross-reference with contemporary events to yield practical guidance for political and military decisions. The consultation process for the Sibylline books involved elaborate rituals that emphasized the gravity of seeking divine guidance for matters affecting the entire Roman state. The College of Priests, initially consisting of 2 members but eventually expanded to 15, would gather in the underground chamber where the books were stored. After performing purification ceremonies and offering appropriate sacrifices, they would examine the relevant passages while seeking correlations between ancient prophecies and current circumstances. Their interpretations, presented to the Senate in formal reports, carried enormous weight in political deliberations and frequently determined the course of major policy decisions. Augustus Caesar's personal devotion to Apollo transformed the god from a useful auxiliary deity into the primary divine patron of the Roman Empire, a transformation that reflected both the emperor's political calculations and his genuine appreciation for Apollo's civilizing attributes. The future emperor's connection to Apollo began during the civil wars that followed Julius Caesar's assassination, when he claimed to have received divine guidance from the god about military strategy and political alliances. These claims, whether based on genuine religious experience or calculated propaganda, established Apollo as Augustus's personal protector and advisor in ways that distinguished the god from other members of the Roman pantheon. The victory at Actium in 31 BC provided Augustus with the opportunity to demonstrate his gratitude to Apollo, while simultaneously establishing the god's role as protector of the new imperial order. The emperor attributed his decisive defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra to Apollo's direct intervention, claiming that the god had appeared on the battlefield in the form of a brilliant light that guided Roman arrows to their targets while blinding enemy forces. Whether or not contemporary observers accepted these supernatural claims, Augustus's public attribution of victory to Apollo's favour created powerful associations between the god and imperial success that would influence Roman religious practice for centuries. The Temple of Apollo Palatinus, constructed on the Palatine Hill adjacent to Augustus's own residence, represented the most ambitious religious building project of the early imperial period and demonstrated the emperor's commitment to establishing Apollo as the preeminent deity of the new regime. The temple's location on the same hill that housed the emperor's palace created physical and symbolic connections between divine authority and imperial power that reinforced Augustus's claims to rule by divine mandate. The proximity also allowed for private consultations between the emperor and Apollo's priests, without the public scrutiny that would have accompanied visits to more accessible temple sites. The architectural magnificence of the Temple of Apollo Palatinus rivaled and in some respects surpassed the grandeur of Jupiter's own sanctuary on the Capitoline Hill, a comparison that contemporary observers would not have missed. The building featured a massive marble facade decorated with sculptural programs that depicted Apollo's mythological victories alongside scenes of Augustus's military triumphs, creating visual parallels between divine and imperial achievement. The interior spaces included a library that housed both Greek and Latin texts, emphasizing Apollo's role as patron of literature and learning, while providing practical resources for the scholarly activities that Augustus promoted as part of his cultural program. The cult statue within the Temple of Apollo Palatinus presented the god in a form that explicitly connected his traditional attributes with contemporary imperial symbolism. The figure held a kitharei, the elaborate lyre associated with professional musical performance, while wearing a laurel crown that referenced both his victory over Python and his role in crowning victorious generals and emperors. The statue's base featured reliefs depicting the Muses alongside personifications of Roman provinces, suggesting that Apollo's cultural influence extended throughout the empire and contributed to the civilizing mission that justified Roman territorial expansion. The dedication ceremonies for the Temple of Apollo Palatinus established religious festivals that became central features of the imperial calendar and provided models for similar celebrations throughout the empire. The Ludi Secularis, secular games held to mark the beginning of new eras in Roman history, featured elaborate performances of choral music and poetry that honoured Apollo's artistic patronage while celebrating the achievements of Augustus's reign. These festivals combined traditional Roman religious practices with Greek cultural elements in ways that created distinctly imperial forms of worship that differentiated the new regime from the republican traditions it had replaced. The economic resources devoted to Apollo's worship under Augustus exceeded those allocated to most other deities, and demonstrated the emperor's commitment to establishing the god as a central figure in imperial religion. The temple complex required enormous quantities of the finest marble, bronze and precious metals, while its construction employed hundreds of skilled craftsmen whose techniques influenced architectural development throughout the empire. The ongoing maintenance of the cult required substantial annual expenditures for sacrificial animals, festival celebrations, and the salaries of priests and temple attendants who served the god's worship. The influence of Apollo's Roman transformation extended beyond the capital to encompass the establishment of cult sites throughout the expanding empire, each adapted to local conditions, while maintaining essential connections to the god's imperial identity. Provincial temples dedicated to Apollo often incorporated architectural elements and decorative programs that reference the Palatine Temple while accommodating regional building traditions and available materials. These structures served as centres for the spread of Roman culture and imperial ideology, as local populations participating in Apollo's worship absorbed Roman values and practices along with religious observances. The development of Apollo's imperial iconography created standardized visual representations that appeared on coins, public monuments, and decorative arts throughout the Roman world. These images typically showed the god in youthful, idealized form, often accompanied by symbols that referenced both his traditional mythological attributes and his role as protector of the imperial family. The lyre, laurel wreath, and bow appeared frequently in these representations, while new symbols like the tripod and sacred serpent emphasized his oracular functions and their importance for imperial decision-making. The integration of Apollo's worship with Roman military practices created new forms of religious observance that combined Greek theological concepts with Roman organizational methods and strategic thinking. Military units throughout the empire adopted Apollo as a patron deity, seeking his guidance before battles and offering thanksgiving sacrifices after victories. The god's association with archery made him particularly popular among auxiliary units recruited from regions with strong archery traditions, while his reputation for accurate prophecy appealed to commanders facing the uncertainties of campaign warfare in unfamiliar territories. The Roman transformation of Apollo's healing aspects reflected imperial needs for medical services that could support large armies, urban populations, and the administrative personnel required for governing a vast territorial empire. Temples dedicated to Apollo Medicus appeared in major cities throughout the Roman world, offering medical services that combined traditional Greek therapeutic practices with Roman organizational efficiency and imperial resources. These institutions served both religious and practical functions, providing healthcare for imperial officials, military personnel, and local populations, while demonstrating the benefits of Roman rule and divine favour. The evolution of Apollo's prophetic functions under Roman patronage created new forms of divination that served imperial administrative needs while maintaining connections to traditional Greek oracular practices. Roman officials developed systematic methods for consulting divine guidance about policy decisions, military campaigns, and responses to natural disasters or political crises. These procedures emphasized written records, formal consultation processes, and careful interpretation of prophetic responses by trained specialists who understood both religious traditions and contemporary political realities. The literary patronage that Augustus extended to poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid created new forms of religious poetry that celebrated Apollo's role in imperial culture while adapting traditional mythological themes to contemporary political circumstances. The Aeneid's portrayal of Apollo as a guiding force in the establishment of Roman civilization provided a theological framework that justified imperial expansion, while connecting Roman achievements to divine will and classical Greek cultural traditions. These literary works influenced popular understanding of Apollo's significance and created cultural narratives that supported imperial ideology through religious imagery and mythological references. The transformation of Apollo's musical patronage under Roman influence created new forms of public entertainment and religious celebration that combined Greek artistic traditions with Roman spectacle and imperial propaganda. The emperor's support for musical competitions, theatrical performances, and poetic recitations provided opportunities for artists throughout the empire to demonstrate their skills while celebrating imperial achievements and divine favour. These cultural activities served multiple functions, providing entertainment for urban populations, creating opportunities for social advancement through artistic achievement, and reinforcing imperial values through cultural participation. The development of Apollo's role as a patron of Roman law and justice reflected the empire's need for divine sanction of its legal institutions and administrative practices. The gods' traditional association with order, rationality, and moral authority made him a natural choice for legitimizing the complex legal systems that governed imperial society. Roman jurists frequently invoked Apollo's guidance in developing legal principles and interpreting existing statutes, while court proceedings sometimes included religious ceremonies that sought divine blessing for judicial decisions. The influence of Apollo's Roman transformation on provincial cultures created hybrid forms of religious practice that combined local traditions with imperial religious requirements and Greek theological concepts, establishing patterns that would persist long after the empire's political collapse. These adaptations proved remarkably durable, surviving the transition from paganism to Christianity and continuing to influence Western cultural development through successive historical periods. The gods' association with reason, artistic excellence, and civilized order provided intellectual frameworks that medieval scholars would later rediscover and reinterpret during the Renaissance, when humanist thinkers sought to reconcile classical wisdom with contemporary Christian theology. The preservation of Apollonian texts and artistic representations during the medieval period occurred primarily through the efforts of Byzantine scholars and Islamic translators who recognized the value of classical knowledge for their own intellectual traditions. Monasteries throughout Europe maintained copies of works by Virgil, Ovid, and other Roman poets who'd celebrated Apollo's influence on imperial culture, while Islamic libraries in Spain, Baghdad, and Cairo preserved Greek philosophical and medical texts that contained detailed discussions of the gods' various attributes and functions. These preservation efforts ensured that Renaissance scholars would have access to comprehensive source materials when they began their systematic re-examination of classical antiquity. The rediscovery of Apollo's mythology and cultural significance during the 14th and 15th centuries coincided with broader humanist movements that emphasized the value of classical learning for understanding human nature and social organization. Scholars like Petrarch and Boccaccio encountered descriptions of Apollo's civilizing influence in ancient texts and recognized parallels between the gods' promotion of rational inquiry and their own efforts to develop new approaches to education, governance, and artistic expression. The gods' traditional association with the harmony between different forms of knowledge, music, mathematics, medicine, and prophecy appealed to Renaissance thinkers who sought to integrate various disciplines within comprehensive intellectual systems. Marsilio Ficino's translations of Platonic texts in late 15th century Florence introduced Renaissance audiences to sophisticated discussions of Apollo's role in ancient philosophical systems, particularly those that emphasized the mathematical relationships underlying both musical harmony and cosmic order. Ficino's work on the Platonic Academy's teachings about divine inspiration and artistic creation provided theoretical frameworks that connected Apollo's mythological attributes to contemporary debates about the nature of genius, creativity, and the relationship between human achievement and divine influence. These translations influenced generations of artists, musicians, and writers who sought to understand the classical foundations of their own creative practices. The architectural revival of classical proportional systems during the Renaissance drew heavily on ancient descriptions of Apollo's temples and their mathematical relationships, as architects like Brunelleschi and Alberti studied Roman ruins and theoretical texts to understand the principles that had governed classical building design. The gods' association with harmony and rational proportion provided philosophical justification for architectural approaches that emphasized mathematical relationships over purely decorative considerations. Renaissance churches, palaces, and public buildings throughout Italy incorporated proportional systems derived from ancient temple architecture, creating visual environments that reflected Apollo's aesthetic principles while serving contemporary religious and political functions. The development of Renaissance musical theory relied extensively on ancient Greek discussions of Apollo's lyre and the mathematical relationships that governed harmonic intervals, as theorists like Giuseppe Zarlino work to understand the numerical foundations of musical consonance and dissonance. The god's traditional role as leader of the Muses provided conceptual frameworks for understanding the relationship between different artistic disciplines, while his association with both mathematical precision and emotional expression offered models for musical composition that balanced technical sophistication with expressive power. Renaissance composers like Palestrina and Monteverdi developed polyphonic techniques that reflected these classical principles while addressing contemporary liturgical and dramatic requirements. The influence of Apollonian ideals on Renaissance education created new institutional forms that combined classical learning with Christian theology in ways that prepared students for both religious and secular careers. The establishment of humanist schools throughout Italy, Germany, and other European regions reflected educational philosophies that emphasized the study of classical texts, mathematical principles, and artistic techniques as essential preparation for civic leadership and intellectual achievement. These institutions produced generations of scholars, artists, and political leaders who understood classical culture as a foundation for contemporary accomplishment rather than merely an object of antiquarian interest. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries drew inspiration from ancient descriptions of Apollo's prophetic abilities and his role in revealing hidden truths about the natural world, as investigators like Galileo and Kepler sought to understand the mathematical principles that governed planetary motion and other celestial phenomena. The god's association with both rational inquiry and divine revelation provided conceptual frameworks that allowed early modern scientists to pursue empirical investigation while maintaining religious faith. The heliocentric model of the solar system, with the Sun at the centre of planetary orbits, created obvious parallels with Apollo's solar attributes and his role as a source of illumination and knowledge. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, progress, and the perfectibility of human society through education and rational inquiry reflected many of the same principles that had characterized Apollo's civilizing influence in ancient mythology. Philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot recognized in the god's traditional attributes his promotion of knowledge, artistic excellence, and social harmony, ideals that aligned with their own efforts to reform European society through the application of rational principles to politics, education, and social organization. The god's opposition to superstition and his emphasis on empirical observation provided historical precedents for Enlightenment critiques of traditional religious authority and political absolutism. The development of neoclassical artistic styles during the 18th century drew extensively on ancient representations of Apollo and other classical deities, as artists like Jacques-Louis David and Antonio Canova sought to create works that embodied the moral and aesthetic principles they associated with classical antiquity. These artists understood Apollo's mythological attributes as symbols of intellectual and artistic achievement that could inspire contemporary audiences to pursue similar excellence in their own endeavours. Neoclassical paintings, sculptures, and architectural designs throughout Europe and America incorporated Apollonian imagery and proportional systems as expressions of Enlightenment values and political ideals. The influence of Apollo's musical patronage on classical composers like Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven reflected their understanding of ancient Greek theories about the relationship between mathematical harmony and emotional expression, as these musicians developed symphonic and chamber music forms that balanced structural sophistication with expressive power. The god's traditional association with both technical mastery and inspired creativity provided models for musical composition that emphasized the importance of formal training while acknowledging the role of individual genius in artistic achievement. The development of public concert halls and music education institutions during this period created new opportunities for experiencing and learning about musical traditions that trace their origins to ancient Greek culture. The archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries at Delphi, Delos, and other sites associated with Apollo's worship provided unprecedented insights into ancient religious practices while confirming many details preserved in literary sources. The excavation of the Sacred Way at Delphi revealed the physical remains of treasuries built by various Greek city-states to house their offerings to Apollo, demonstrating the economic and political importance of the oracle in ancient interstate relations. The discovery of inscribed dedications, votive offerings, and architectural fragments provided concrete evidence for the scale and sophistication of ancient religious practices while illuminating aspects of Greek society that had been poorly understood from literary sources alone. The French excavations at Delphi, conducted systematically between 1892 and 1903, uncovered the foundations of Apollo's temple, along with numerous sculptures, inscriptions, and architectural elements that revealed the sanctuary's development over more than a millennium of continuous use. The famous charioteer of Delphi, a bronze sculpture commemorating a victory in the Pythian Games, demonstrated the artistic excellence that characterized major votive offerings while providing insights into ancient athletic competitions and their religious significance. The discovery of the sacred spring and the remains of the Pythia's consultation chamber confirmed ancient descriptions of the oracle's physical arrangements while raising new questions about the mechanisms through which prophetic inspiration was believed to occur. The ongoing excavations on Delos, begun in the late 19th century and continuing into the present, have revealed extensive remains of Apollo's birthplace sanctuary, along with evidence for the island's role as a major commercial and religious centre throughout antiquity. The archaeological evidence demonstrates the accuracy of ancient literary descriptions of the island's sacred groves, temples, and festival spaces, while providing new information about the economic activities that supported the sanctuary's operations. The discovery of thousands of inscriptions recording religious dedications, commercial transactions, and administrative decisions has created an unparalleled archive of information about ancient Greek religious and economic practices. The excavation of other Apollonian sites throughout the Mediterranean world has revealed the extent of the god's worship and its adaptation to local conditions and cultural preferences. The sanctuary at Didyma in Asia Minor, with its massive temple and elaborate oracle procedures, demonstrated the continuation of Greek religious traditions under Roman rule, while showing how imperial patronage influenced the development of provincial cult sites. Archaeological work at Syrian in North Africa, Naucratis in Egypt, and other colonial sites has revealed how Greek settlers adapted Apollo's worship to new environments while maintaining connections to traditional cult centres in the Aegean region. The discovery of ancient medical instruments, pharmaceutical preparations, and hospital facilities at Apollonian healing sanctuaries has provided concrete evidence for the sophisticated medical practices that developed under the god's patronage. Excavations at Epidaurus and other Asclepieion sites have revealed surgical instruments, pharmaceutical grinding equipment, and patient accommodation facilities that demonstrate the integration of religious and rational approaches to medical treatment. The analysis of ancient prescriptions and treatment records preserved on stone tablets has enhanced understanding of Greek medical theory and practice, while revealing the extent to which religious and empirical approaches to healing were combined in ancient therapeutic systems. The influence of Apollo's imagery and symbolism on contemporary culture extends far beyond academic interest in classical antiquity to encompass active appropriation of ancient symbols for modern purposes and institutions. The laurel wreath continues to serve as a symbol of achievement and excellence in academic, athletic, and artistic contexts, while the lyre appears in the logos and decorations of musical organizations, educational institutions, and cultural foundations throughout the world. The god's association with the sun and solar imagery has influenced the naming and symbolic representation of space exploration programs, renewable energy initiatives, and scientific research projects that emphasize illumination, discovery, and the expansion of human knowledge. The Apollo space program, which achieved the first human landing on the Moon in 1969, explicitly drew on the god's solar associations and his role as a bringer of light and knowledge to humanity. The program's name reflected both the ambitious scope of the lunar exploration missions and the connection between ancient mythological themes and contemporary scientific achievement. The success of the Apollo missions created new cultural associations between the god's name and humanity's capacity for technological innovation and exploration of previously inaccessible realms, extending ancient themes of divine guidance and human achievement into the context of modern space exploration. The continuing influence of Apollonian aesthetics on contemporary architecture, music, and visual arts demonstrates the enduring appeal of classical principles of harmony, proportion, and rational design. Modern architects working in neoclassical and classical revival styles continue to employ proportional systems derived from ancient temple architecture, while contemporary composers and performers study ancient Greek musical theory as a foundation for understanding harmonic relationships and compositional techniques. The god's emphasis on the integration of technical mastery with expressive creativity continues to influence artistic education and cultural institutions that seek to balance traditional training with innovative approaches to creative expression. The appropriation of Apollo's imagery by political movements and national symbols throughout the modern period has created complex relationships between ancient religious symbols and contemporary ideological purposes. The god's association with civilization, rational order, and cultural achievement has made his imagery attractive to political systems that seek to legitimize their authority through appeals to classical precedents and cultural sophistication. However, these appropriations have sometimes distorted or oversimplified the complex and often contradictory aspects of Apollo's mythological character, reducing his multifaceted nature to simple symbols of power and cultural superiority. The academic study of Apollo's mythology and cultural significance has evolved into a sophisticated interdisciplinary field that combines archaeological evidence, literary analysis, religious studies, and cultural anthropology to understand the god's role in ancient society and his continuing influence on Western civilization. Modern scholars have moved beyond simple identification of mythological themes to examine the social, political, and economic context that shaped the development of Apollo's worship and its adaptation to changing historical circumstances. This research has revealed the complexity of ancient religious practices, while demonstrating the ways in which mythological traditions both reflected and influenced the societies that preserved and transmitted them. The digital preservation and dissemination of information about Apollo's mythology, archaeological remains, and cultural influence has created new opportunities for public engagement with classical antiquity while supporting ongoing scholarly research and educational initiatives. Online databases containing high-resolution images of ancient artifacts, detailed site plans of archaeological excavations, and comprehensive bibliographies of scholarly publications have made information about Apollo's worship accessible to global audiences while facilitating collaborative research projects that span multiple institutions and national boundaries. These digital resources have democratized access to classical knowledge while supporting new forms of scholarly collaboration and public education. The therapeutic and educational applications of Apollo's mythological themes in contemporary psychology, music therapy, and educational programs demonstrate the continuing relevance of ancient insights about human nature and the relationship between artistic expression and psychological well-being. Mental health professionals have drawn on the god's association with healing, harmony, and the integration of rational and emotional aspects of human experience to develop treatment approaches that combine cognitive therapy with creative expression. Music therapists utilize the ancient understanding of music's capacity to influence mood and behavior, while educational programs employ Apollo's role as patron of the arts to justify comprehensive approaches to cultural education that emphasize the interconnection between different forms of knowledge and creative expression. The environmental movement's appropriation of Apollo's solar imagery and his association with natural cycles and cosmic order has created new contexts for ancient religious symbols while addressing contemporary concerns about climate change, renewable energy, and humanity's relationship with the natural world. Solar energy initiatives frequently employ Apollonian imagery to represent the harnessing of natural forces for human benefit, while environmental education programs draw on ancient Greek understanding of the interconnection between human society and natural systems to promote sustainable development practices and ecological awareness. The globalization of classical education and cultural appreciation has created worldwide communities of scholars, artists, and enthusiasts who study and celebrate Apollo's mythology and its cultural significance across different national and cultural boundaries. International conferences, collaborative research projects, and cultural exchange programs have facilitated the sharing of knowledge about ancient Greek culture, while demonstrating the universal appeal of themes associated with Apollo's worship. These global networks have preserved and transmitted classical knowledge while adapting ancient insights to contemporary circumstances and cultural contexts. The continuing evolution of Apollo's cultural significance demonstrates the remarkable durability of mythological themes and religious symbols that address fundamental aspects of human experience and social organization. The gods' association with the pursuit of knowledge, artistic excellence, rational inquiry, and the harmonious integration of different aspects of human nature continues to resonate with contemporary audiences who face similar challenges in balancing competing demands and aspirations. The persistence of Apollonian themes in modern culture suggests that the ancient Greeks identified enduring patterns in human psychology and social development that transcend specific historical circumstances while remaining relevant to successive generations facing new challenges and opportunities. The story of Apollo thus represents more than simply the mythology of an ancient deity. It embodies humanity's continuing efforts to understand the relationship between divine inspiration and human achievement, the balance between rational inquiry and emotional expression, and the role of cultural refinement in creating civilized society. From his dramatic birth on Delos through his establishment of the Delphic Oracle, his complex relationships with mortals, and his transformation under Roman patronage, Apollo's mythology has provided frameworks for understanding fundamental questions about knowledge, creativity, justice, and the human condition. His influence on Renaissance humanism, Enlightenment rationalism, and contemporary culture demonstrates the enduring power of classical themes to inspire and guide human endeavour across centuries and civilizations. The golden god who once drove the sun across ancient skies continues to illuminate the path toward wisdom, beauty, and the harmonious integration of human potential in all its diverse manifestations,